None of your usual comments.
Yeah, so until we start, if you want to have private conversation.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started right on legislative time. Welcome to this, I believe it's our fourth meeting of the Senate and Assembly Select Committees on Improving State Government. Marion came right up on cue, so I don't have to invite you. Just a few brief comments. We have 3 panels, and we're scheduled to go until 5. This is a subject matter that brings out the both sadistic and masochistic aspects of many of us. Having spent 4 terms on the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors, having followed one of our panelists on the 3rd panel, Sonny Wright McPeak in Contra Costa County, and before that, having been on a city council, it is no small observation to say that our relationship between the state and local government is one that's dysfunctional. When I was in local government in the county, I used to say that we had a lot of clients who would come for health and social service issues, and they would often come from trying family situations, and then they would come to the county government and the state government and be engaged in probably one of the most dysfunctional of families, in spite of many of our family members, and I mean our employees and a lot of our stakeholders, really doing heroic work. And I say that very specifically, that in spite of the way we've structured government. So it is with a little anxiety that we enter into this discussion. I know that there's a lot of opinions, but we feel like, as we've gone through these hearings, that in this kind of circumstance, the double-edged sword, the Milton Friedman quote about never wasting a good crisis, that there's an opportunity to change much of what's wrong systemically with California. And I would make the opinion, given my background, that there's no place that needs more improvement than the relationship between the state and local government, and ultimately the delivery of services. And we think we can improve those. So this is meant to be a starting off point, and also something meant to stimulate ideas on how we could go to a situation that's better for all of us, and that we can perform our jobs in such a way that our clients and the taxpayers all feel better and have much greater confidence in the jobs we do. So with that, I will turn it over to my co-chair for any comments, and we're told we're going to have a very good turnout, and the sergeant tells me that many of the members are en route in the building right now, so we'll be joined by up to as many as 20 members, which by the standards of this building is a very good thing. So I'll turn it over to Assemblymember Feuer for any comments.
And as if on cue, we're joined by our colleague, Mr. Blumenfield. It's a good thing. There's a lot of heavy traffic on the elevators, I understand, so people will get here soon.
Literally.
No, I just want to say a few things. You know, I, like Mr. DeSaulnier, I come from local government, City Council in Los Angeles. And, you know, for me, this discussion is about a few things. You know, assuring that we emerge from this with ideas that better match resources with responsibilities, making the work of delivering services and the responsibility of paying taxes much more transparent, so people really have a sense of what they're getting and why. And I'm a local control guy as well, so local control is important to me. Accountability at the same time is also very important to me. So I guess the last thing I would say is, in all the discussions over the years about the alignment issues and who pays what for what services, there are some issues that never have been resolved well, including how do we assure that we give local government incentives to develop properly? How do we give them the resources they need without having them make decisions on land use, for example, that may be detrimental in the long run but are important because they need the tax revenue? So lots of very concrete things to explore today. I'm looking forward to it very much. And Mr. DeSaulnier, back to you.
Okay. And Mr. Feuer and I are going to co-chair this meeting. I'm going to start with the first panel and then ask Mike to run the meeting for the middle, and then I'll come in as the closer. So Marianne O'Malley's here to tell us you're our therapist. This is an intervention. This is an overview of how the relationship between the state and local government evolved, which is heavily edited, I think, there, to what it is today, where we are, and how we got here. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Marianne O'Malley from the Legislative Analyst Office. You asked me to explain to you the history, the evolution of the tangled state-local fiscal relationship in about 20 minutes. And I thought perhaps the best way to do this, the most helpful for you, is to summarize the top 10 events, the 10 events that have had the most lasting effect on the state-local relationship. I suspect there are still many other events that you'll be hearing about from the members of the audience a little bit later today. But let me give you a perspective on the 10 events that have really shaped state-local relationships. And I'm going to start going way, way back, about 100 years ago, at a time when there were very similar disputes in this building regarding state-local government. There were a lot of disputes about control over the property tax that would sound very modern today. And you should know at that time, just like today, there was interest in both state use of the property tax and local use of the property tax. And in fact, 100 years ago, the state's general fund, its primary revenue source was the property tax. And that caused a lot of friction between state and local government. And there was a long series of different commissions and review groups and reports on the tangled, difficult state-local relationship 100 years ago. And the result of it was the Senate put a measure on the ballot, a constitutional amendment, to separate state and local revenues. It's called the Separation of Sources Act of 1910. It was a constitutional amendment. Under that amendment, the state said it would no longer tax property, but it would tax the railroads and the telegraph and the telephone industry. Local governments, though, would tax property, and each local government could set its own rate. Throughout the United States, this was viewed as one of the strongest action of empowering local government and was reported in the textbooks for decades afterwards. The importance of it today, and the reason why I begin with it, is that there's still a perception that our local governments have significant fiscal independence. And as you'll see over the rest of the story, that a lot of that fiscal independence of local governments has been modified over the time since this. Number two, now we've gone from 1910 all the way into the depths of the Great Depression. It was during this time that the federal government created many of the safety net programs that we know today, or the predecessors of those programs. And the federal government knew that it couldn't administer the program from Washington, and so it offered the programs to the state. And wanting to make sure the state was efficient, it said, state, you need to put in a share of your own costs for this health and social services program. And in California, we looked at these programs and said, we can't administer them centrally from Sacramento in a state as large and as diverse as California. So let's have our counties administer them. And in order to make sure that our counties administer them efficiently, we'll have counties have a share of costs for these programs. So within about 2 decades, counties, the role of counties shifted from being primarily an entity of government responsible for local initiated programs to being a level of government administering state and federal programs. So within about 2 decades, about half of the county revenues weren't coming from local sources, but were coming from state and federal sources to administer state and federal programs. The importance today is you need to understand that state and county finances are married. They're completely connected with regards to a large number of programs. And for better or worse, during times of fiscal difficulty on the state side, we've modified those relationships between state and counties, those fiscal relationships on some programs, and sometimes in ways that counties don't approve of. We're speeding on. We're now at number 3, and we're in 1952. During the 1950s, the state wanted to create a dedicated revenue source for cities to use to match federal funds, federal housing funds. And the Assembly put a measure, a constitutional measure, before the voters to create the framework for what is now called redevelopment law, and to put the framework for redevelopment law into the Constitution. And under redevelopment law, it authorizes redevelopment agencies to pledge to receive property tax growth in defined areas. So in a particular area of the community that is defined as blighted, the redevelopment agency would get the growth in the property taxes, not the city, the county, and the school districts that also serve that property. Redevelopment agencies get this property tax, and they're allowed to pledge that property tax against debt obligations. The important thing to note here is that they don't need to get local agency approval before creating redevelopment, and they don't need to get voter approval before taking on this debt. In the beginning, during the early 1950s and in 60s, redevelopment use was relatively modest. But over time, especially as constraints on county and city finances have grown, the use of redevelopment has also grown. If you look at the chart there, it shows about 12% of all assessed valuation of property taxes collected by the auditors are allocated to redevelopment agencies statewide, but there are some counties where it's very large. In San Bernardino, Riverside, and Butte, about 1 in 5 property taxes collected are not allocated to the school districts or the cities, but are allocated to the redevelopment agency. So a significant change in local fiscal relationship in here in 1952. Speeding on to number 4 on our top 10 list. We get to 1972. And this is a time when property tax rates were escalating. And in part, this was because the counties had some significant obligations for using part of their property tax rate for paying for those state and federal health and safety services programs. So the property tax rate was increasing. There was also a lot of concerns regarding unequal funding levels for schools. And the year before, 1971, the California Supreme Court had resolved the First for Serrano case and had ruled the California financing system for schools to be unconstitutional. So in 1972, the legislature did 3 things. The first thing it did is it set a maximum property tax rate for all the cities and counties and the special districts and schools. It said it could be the rate that you had in 1970 or in 1971, but you can't raise the rate any higher, okay? The second thing it did, it said, we know that sometimes our program obligations put pressure, fiscal pressure on you. So we promise that we will reimburse you for mandates. Okay, it was a statutory promise, stems from 1972. And the third thing the legislature did was created revenue limits, which is essentially the marriage of state and school finance. For revenue limits, forever after, you probably have had a consultant tell you, revenue limits are like a bucket, all right? School revenues are like a bucket, and every school district puts their property taxes into that bucket, and then the state looks into the bucket and fills the remainder up with general fund money. And that's the revenue bucket analogy. It stems from 1972. The importance today is that it largely ended the direct relationship between a school district's property taxes and its overall resources. Its overall resources are not defined as their property taxes anymore. It's defined as the size of that revenue limit bucket plus whatever categorical programs the legislature creates. So there's no longer a direct relationship between a school district's revenues, overall resources, and the level of their property taxes. And we've inextricably linked state and school finance. So we're going on now to number 5, 1978 and Prop 13. Because the legislature had capped property tax rates, homeowners expected that their property tax bills were going to go down. In many cases, they were frustrated. Although the property tax rates either stayed the same or declined, for most homeowners, they didn't actually see smaller property tax bills. And the reasons for this are many. The three principal ones were, at that time, property values for single-family homes were increasing really fast, much faster than other types of properties. So the portion of the property tax roll that was comprised by homeowners, single-family homeowners, that 1/3 of the property tax roll, that was increasing, but all the rest of them were not increasing that remarkably fast. The second thing is that in terms of commercial industrial property, there was some significant concern that they were over-assessed, and there was pressure to bring down those assessments. And the third thing is that there was very high inflation rate at this time and population growth, and so there were greater pressures on local government to raise revenues. So overall, many homeowners might have seen their rates stay a little bit down, stay the same or go a little bit down, but their overall property tax bill was increasing, and then many of them were getting quite frustrated. So the voters then passed Proposition 13. And it made many important changes, which I summarized there in terms of the changes to the tax rate and also the 2/3 vote requirements that were imposed, both in terms of local special taxes and also for legislative approval for new state taxes. I think perhaps more than any of these individual provisions of Prop 13, the most lasting effect of it is on state local governance. Under Proposition 13, state and local revenues are still separate, but the state now controls the major local revenue source. It has control over the allocation of the local property tax. So that's an enormous governance change in terms of who's got the authority to say how the property tax should be allocated, a very significant governance change. The other significant change is on state fiscal authority. Under Prop 13, the legislature can still create new programs with a majority vote. But to raise taxes to pay for those programs requires a 2/3 vote. And under pre-existing constitutional provisions, to reallocate the budget to fund that new program requires a 2/3 vote. So creating a program obligation is a majority vote. Paying for it requires a greater political consensus. So it's not as surprising that we oftentimes have more spending obligations than we have funds available to pay for those obligations. Moving on to number 6, 1979. Proposition 13 shifted the responsibility for allocating the property tax to the state, to the legislature. But it didn't say how the legislature was supposed to do it. There were thousands of local governments receiving property taxes, and all the communities were different. Some cities were full-service cities, some were partial service cities. Some areas had fire districts, some did not. And so all of a sudden there was this enormous responsibility placed on the legislature to allocate the property tax to all these very different communities, and it didn't know how to do it. The other thing is that with the great reduction in property taxes, local government program obligations were much greater than their funds that they had available. So the legislature decided to do two things. First, it decided that it wanted to backfill some local government revenue losses. It wanted to hold local governments partially harmless for the effect of Proposition 13. And so to do this, the legislature took a couple actions. First, it looked at the counties and reduced their program costs for a variety of health and social services programs by about $1 billion. The other thing it did is it used its authority over the property tax to reduce the share of property taxes going to schools and increase the share of property taxes going to cities, counties, and special districts. And you can see that there on the line going on down the bottom. You can see in 1975, schools got a little over 50% of the property tax, and then there was a great reduction on it after Proposition 13. And what was happening there was the legislature was deciding to shift some of those property taxes to cities, counties, and special districts, and to backfill schools with state general fund money. So schools would be held harmless, and cities, counties, and special districts would get a greater share of the property tax. In terms of the allocation of the property tax to individual cities, counties, and special districts, after a long year of debates and public hearings, the legislature ultimately decided that it could not develop a single formula for allocating the property tax. And so it did pretty much the only thing that I think it could have done, which is it basically said prorate it based on how it was done during the years immediately before Proposition 13. Prorate the taxes so that if you were a city or a special district or a county that generally had a larger share of the property tax before Proposition 13, your share would continue to be that larger share going forward into the future. The importance of this today is twofold. First, the property tax allocation decisions of the 1970s on a community-by-community basis were largely locked in place. So today, if you were to ask what's a city or a special district share of the property tax, you can make a pretty good guess by saying what was their tax rate, their proportionate share of the taxes during the 3 years prior to Proposition 13. The other thing that's important to note is the state assumed greater financing responsibilities under this measure, both the increased share of costs for the county health and social services programs and also the ongoing cost of backfilling the schools for their reduced property taxes. Moving ahead to number 7, realignment. The early 1990s were a time of a great deal of fiscal stress for the state. One of the more creative responses was in 1991, and it's oftentimes called the mental health realignment or the health and social services realignment. And under this plan, the state increased taxes. In this case, it was a sales tax and the vehicle license fee. And it shifted those funds along with some program obligations and some program authority to counties. And in some cases, particularly in the case of mental health, where the state shifted funding and a significant amount of program authority, that there were some program outcome benefits associated with this realignment. In other cases where the legislature shifted funding but did not shift a significant amount of authority, it didn't fundamentally yield greater program outcomes than otherwise would be the case. The importance of this measure is it's an example of the fluidity of state-county program relations over time. And it also sort of stands for the concept that in some cases, local control over a program might be more efficient, might get us better program outcomes than maintaining the program at the state level. Moving ahead to number 8, these are the dreaded ERAF shifts. Early 1990s were a time of great fiscal stress for the state. During this period, the state lost the revenue reduction of about 1/3 of the state's general fund. Very, very significant difficulties for the state. And the state ultimately decided that it could not afford to continue the ABA bailout at the same level that it had anticipated in 1979. I mean, over a course of 2 years, it reversed a portion of the ABA bailout. What ERAF did is it shifted about 1/6 of the statewide property taxes, shifted property taxes from cities, counties, special districts to schools. And in the chart that I show down here on the bottom, I can kind of give you the display. Those are the property taxes immediately before the ERAF shifts, and you can see the darkened share that went to the schools. The schools were getting about 1/3 of the property tax. Then after the shifts, you see schools still get that 1/3, but then there's this new fund called ERAF, and ERAF exists in every county level, and it's funding that otherwise would have gone to cities, counties, and special districts, but those property taxes are shifted into ERAF, and ERAF then in turn is shifted to schools, and that offsets state general fund obligations for schools. The formulas for implementing these 1992 and 1993 ERAF shifts are exceedingly complex. They're based somewhat on the individual local government's relative share of the ABA bailout, but it's only based on that to some extent. In the case of counties, and to lesser extent cities, part of the fiscal impact of these ERAF shifts was offset by a Prop 172 half-cent sales tax, which the voters approved in its pledge for public safety. The importance of the ERAF shift today, I think, are twofold. First, it generated tremendous local government distrust. The state was using its authority over the property tax, authority granted to it under Proposition 13, but it was using that authority for the fiscal benefit of the state. The second thing is that with the ERAF amounts and the individual formulas that to implement ERAF, and also the formulas to implement the Prop 172 half-cent sales tax, there have been ongoing debates regarding the fairness of any single entity's relative burden under ERAF or relative benefit under the Prop 172 allocations. Moving ahead to number 9. In 2004, the triple flip and the swap. In early 2004, for very different reasons, the state acted to permanently reduce local government revenues. In the case of the vehicle license fee swap, the intent was to provide ongoing permanent tax relief. And in the case of the triple flip, it was part of a state economic recovery effort. In both cases, the state redirected resources from every county's ERAF. Remember that darkened part on the bottom of that chart that I showed you before? The state redirected revenues from ERAF to reimburse cities and counties for their losses under the vehicle license fee swap and the triple flip. So what we have here, just to walk you through the scenario, remember ERAF that share the property taxes is property taxes that otherwise would have gone to cities, counties, and special districts. So some of those property taxes that have come from cities, counties, and special districts to go into those ERAF pod and that were originally intended then to be allocated to schools are now being redirected to reimburse cities and counties for their reduced vehicle license fee revenues and their reduced sales tax revenues. Okay. It not only incredibly complicates the whole property tax allocation system, it makes it extremely difficult for you to explain to local residents who ask you how is the property tax allocated. It also demonstrates the tremendous fungibility of the property tax and the extent of state authority over local taxes. Here we have the state taking an action to reduce the vehicle license fee and the sales tax and replace it with property taxes that otherwise would have gone to schools. And number 10, Proposition 1A. As a result of many of the actions that in numbers, I guess numbers 1 through 9, there was a tremendous amount of local interest in sealing off local revenue streams from ongoing state control. In Proposition 1A, the voters reduced the state's authority to reallocate the property tax. They also reduced the state's authority to reduce local sales tax rates or to modify local sales tax allocations. And they also reduced the state's authority to make further vehicle license fee rate reductions. Proposition 1A also expanded the state's requirement regarding payment of mandates. The importance of this today in terms of Proposition 1A is that the state's authority to do some of the stuff that we've done in the past in terms of the ERAF shifts and the vehicle license fee swap and the triple flip, some of that authority is constrained, okay? On the flip side, we don't have in Proposition 1A any increase in local authority. There's no increased fiscal authority in terms of revenue rate raising authority or reallocation authority. So we have a diminution of state authority without a significant increase in local authority. There is some increased attention to mandates under Proposition 1A. In terms of bringing us to today, the state-local relationship today, the local authority that was anticipated in the Separation of Sources Act 100 years ago, where local governments would have their own control over a property tax rate and would be accountable directly to their voters as to how that how they spent it, and it would have authority to raise or lower it, and the state relying on an entirely different source of revenues. That kind of separation and accountability isn't evident today. There is a very blurred line between what the state is responsible for doing and what local governments are responsible for doing, which makes it really difficult to know which level of government to hold accountable. And as over the years you've seen, leads to tremendous amounts of intergovernmental tension. And with that, I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Well, thank you. That was a real hoot for a top 10 list. Really, maybe it's a possibility for revenue source, Senator Leno. I did want to both welcome and ask our colleague, Assemblymember Blakesley, if you want to make any comments. We have endeavored all of these meetings to be both bicameral and bipartisan, and if you'd like to make any comments, Mr. Republican leader would welcome this, as this obviously requires a rocket scientist to fix.
Well, thank you, Mr. Desaulnier. I appreciate that. Obviously, I'm delighted to be here, and my colleague, Mr. Berryhill, who walked in as well, has joined us. We're delighted to be a part of these deliberations and discussions, and are particularly appreciative of the chairs for their tireless efforts, especially during the fall break, when typically folks are at home with their families, and after the special session on water and special session on education, other items. I know it's been a long year, so I just commend everyone who's engaging, because I know our families await, and hopefully we can find some reforms we can all embrace.
Thank you. Mr. Fuhrer.
Yeah, I just want to ask a couple questions, and I want to begin by saying the materials that we've been able to review, many of which were prepared by you, as because you've been so deeply involved in this issue for a long time, reflect many legislative efforts to try to come to grips with some key goals. Increasing stability for local governments financially, increasing accountability, as you mentioned, enhancing local control. And yet most of those legislative efforts haven't been particularly successful. I wanted to get you to share with us, please, some key lessons from those prior legislative efforts that we can learn that would help make us as effective as we can in a year when we can't afford to evade this issue. We have to tackle it. I think it's important for us to do it with as much specificity as possible. And just the other questions I have are also of this sort of general nature. Given those goals, what are the couple most important non-constitutional changes you think we can promote, and the most important constitutional change or changes that you think would be relevant to, again, enhance the fiscal stability of local jurisdictions, enhance accountability, provide the right incentives to local government when it comes to financing, these things. Yeah, I think there are important lessons for us to learn from this, and there are a couple or three really big things we might want to pursue, and you have as much expertise as anybody in the building.
In terms of lessons learned, I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned over the years is it's very difficult to make change without winners and losers. And so to the extent that you wish to give one local government greater authority, it can make other local governments significantly concerned about shifting revenues. I have to say, I'd have to think about what it is that could be done without significant constitutional change. At this point, local government and state resources are so strongly fixed. It's very difficult to sort out what it is that could be done. I don't mean to be remarkably discouraging. One of the things our office has argued for many years is the property tax is California's second or third largest source of revenues. Yet we have no modern mechanism at the local level for allocating it. We can't say whether or not the property tax should continue to be allocated in the same fashion as it is right now. It may be that a specific community would rather more of their property taxes going to a city and less to their special district, or the other way around. We've argued many times in the past that really what we should do is to work on creating a mechanism that at the local level there could be a modern revisiting of the AB8 formulas to figure out at the local community level what's the best way, how do local residents and local governments want the property tax to be allocated. The formulas that are based in the 1970s may not make much sense today. Creating a mechanism, though, for revisiting those AB8 shares are very difficult, and that gets to my first point, which is it's very difficult to consider reform if you begin with the assumption that there's going to be no winners and no losers. In terms of other local government actions or actions the legislature could take without constitutional change, I'd like to go back and bounce that idea off with my colleagues now, because it's very difficult to sort out what could we do, especially given what the state is facing in terms of fiscal difficulties. So with the committee's pleasure, I'd be happy to get back with you on that in terms of changes that we could make shy of a constitutional change that could greatly enhance local government fiscal authority and accountability.
And constitutionally, what do you think are the big headlines? And then I'm done.
That's a rhetorical question. Other comments or questions?
No, actually, it wasn't rhetorical.
Okay.
No, I was serious. Are there some key one or two major changes constitutionally that would advance the goals that are reflected in our materials that I sort of restated at the outset of my question?
Okay. Member Blakesley, did you want to respond to that, or do you want to go back and Ms. O'Malley? We're waiting for your headlines, I think. Did you want to
respond on constitutional changes that are the most significant for us to consider?
I'd like to be able to get back with you on that in draft discussion with my colleagues.
I had a feeling. Mr. Blakesley.
And this is a more general question. As you look around at the other states and how they've dealt with this sort of mixing of roles, responsibilities, and sources of revenue with regard to different programs, do any jump out in your mind as being, exemplary for handling sources intelligently or dividing these responsibilities in a way that avoids some of the conflicts and raids and wars that we've experienced here?
Intergovernmental tension is inevitable whenever you have multiple levels of government serving the same people. Okay, you're always going to have some level of government wanting to make changes that another level of government isn't going to be happy with. What we find, though, in other states is that the property tax is not allocated in a centralized fashion. Okay, that's one of the key differences. Even there are other states that have limitations on terms of assessment changes and in terms of rates. California is not. Prop 13 went perhaps a bit beyond many other states, but there's many other states that have got some kinds of constraints on the property tax. The allocation of those revenues being under control by Sacramento is a significant concern. Proposition 13 doesn't require that it be allocated according to a specific state law. What the legislature could have done in 1979 is to say the state law that allocates the property tax would be a local charter. It would be some kind of a community consensus. It could have said that this should be allocated based on an annual or every 5-year local expression. All right. Instead, what we did is we put into law the formulas that were based on the years immediately before Proposition 13. So what we have is a situation where the major source of local revenues is under control of the state legislature. And I think one of the things that is different or is significantly different between California and other states is at the local level in other states, they've got some ability to raise or lower or reallocate local property taxes.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Blakesley was kind enough to ask go in the direction that I was going. But in reference to Mr. Fear's comments or questions before, Could we expect to get answers to those questions before the next hearing? Because I know that will be a kind of a wrap-up, and it would be nice to be able to reflect on those beforehand.
My apologies. When is the next hearing?
Middle of January.
I'd be happy to, Shirley.
So if you could have a draft by 5 o'clock today,
That'd be great. Thank you.
Including the language to implement them, right?
See, some things never change. Senator Leno.
Thank you. I, first of all, want to express my appreciation for the historic overview, because it is fascinating, and I'm sure any number of people could give a different selection of top 10, but I think probably 7, 8, 9 of them would have to fall in everyone's top 10 choices, because they are so significantly impactful over these 100 years. And it appears that in a couple of cases where we had major changes in the way state and local agencies work together came as a result of a cut in taxes. And so, as in follow the money, it's always the money that we're talking about, who controls it, how much there is to control. So we understand there are reasons that led up to Prop 13, and you touched on any number of them. But as a result of Prop 13, we, just the year later, got to Prop 8, because there had to be less money, but no one wanted to feel the pain. So how are we going to deal with that equitably? And then again in 2003-4, with the 2/3 cut in the 50-year-old VLF, a similar problem arose. How were we going to have that much less revenue and have no one feel the pain? And so as a result of that decision, we came up with this tortured, contorted triple flip swap, and then simultaneously went to the ballot with Prop 1A. So you cut back the money, and I think if we're looking to untie the knots, it's when did the knots actually congeal, and what caused that to happen? And I think every time we respond to politics of the day, which lead to a cut in taxes, we find ourselves getting ever more contorted, because we want to try to do as much as before, but we have less. And then the big question is, who's going to feel the pain? So it's just an assessment from this particular San Francisco legislator. And I say with all due respect, historically, recognizing there were real reasons that led to Prop 13. There were real reasons that led to the 2/3 cut in the VLF. It's just that I think there's an argument to be made that because of those decisions to try to do with less, we got tighter in our knot.
Senator Wolk.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up just a little bit on the work of the LAO with respect to AB 8. You have, in our materials, we have a report from you in February of 2000 talking about reconsidering AB 8. I had a hearing of the Senate Rev and Tax Committee, and we focused on the Tax Commission report and tax reform, not just the commission, but what others have mentioned or have proposed with respect to tax reform. One of the issues that did come up was the realignment issues, the reallocation of AB 8, in particular with respect to realignment in certain areas like education or transportation. There's work being done in those areas and has been done. What I'd like to know from the LAO is, do you have or could you update your year 2000 pretty complete study of reconsidering AB 8 to take into account the triple flip and 1A, and whether or not that really does, whether or not there's any opportunity for reallocation of the property tax, given the new constraints?
Let me see if I understand your question. I think there were 5 different scenarios that we sketched out in reconsidering AB 8. Some of those scenarios we had drafted to be possible without constitutional change, and some required constitutional change. And are you asking which of those that were statutorily permissible in 2000, do they continue to be statutorily permissible today?
That would be one of the questions. And then any other, I'm not certain whether the triple flip, as Mark was saying, and 1A and other decisions that have been made in the interim add another set of constraints to unraveling this AB8 allocation. Because in order to do realignment, I think we're going to have to look seriously at undoing that or changing that AB8 allocation. It would be helpful.
Certainly all the proposals that we sketched there would be more, or the statutory changes that we sketched there would be more difficult given the triple flip and the VLF swap and Proposition 1A of 2004. But we'd be happy to take a look at it and get back to you.
Just a couple questions. Ms. Malley, the Constitutional Revision Commission, I'm told, actually made some suggestions consistent with your comments about giving more ability to reallocate and charters. You care to comment on any of those and maybe what happened to those when the idea came, when the commission came back to the legislature? I know that there was legislation, and if memory serves me, Assemblymember Eisenberg was one of the authors. Could we look at language like that when you come back as sort of an example, maybe a prototype that we could suggest?
I'd be happy to follow up with you. I'm not sure if I remember specifically the proposal that you're talking about, but I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Okay. And then the second thing is just from a historical perspective. We're coming up on the 100th year anniversary of the initiative system, which was 1911, I believe. So 1910, we tried to do Separation of Sources Act. Personally, I think that would be a good thing to go back to that. And this may go to Mike's question, so you may need, obviously, to take time with this. But other than a charter, sort of trying to untie the whole Gordian knot, because when you look at this, it's been done. I think I read recently that somebody used the analogy, a writer, of we kept painting over thick layers of paint every time we tried to do the relationship between state and local government, and now probably needs a complete varnish back to the. So obviously you'd have to do it constitutionally, but since we have initiatives out there about a constitutional convention and the efforts of California Forward, and we have the recommendations from the commission, is it best to continue on this sort of ad hoc process, which we may attempt to do again, or is it better to just try to go back to 1910, as it were, when I assume that there were maybe 2 million people in the state of California? So a lot of these things happened. They didn't happen completely in isolation in regards to what happened in the legislature. I mean, the world's been a very dynamic place for the last 100 years.
In terms of which, I mean, there are two different options. There is the wipe the slate clean and reinvent government, and there's got certain appeal to that in terms of you look at a mess and you go, wouldn't it be great to start all over again? I once had a colleague who looked at me, and after giving him a story similar to this top 10, he looked at me and said, you got to go back to your office and erase your hard drive. You know, it's like we got to start over, was his perspective.
That might be one of our recommendations.
It is, I certainly understand the frustration. This is a very, very messy, complicated system. All of these events, though, happen for specific reasons, and they happen because people had some very deep-seated concerns with regard to a particular measure or another measure. So it's kind of impossible in some ways to wipe the slate clean and completely start over again without knowing the interests that led to all of these different provisions. So yes, we'd understand the frustration, we'd understand the desire, but I think it would be impossible to forget all the actions that have happened and to forget all the concerns that led to many of these actions occurring. Whether or not we could do significant reform given the current Constitution, I'm not certain, and I'd be very interested in hearing many of the speakers that are going to be following me as to whether or not they think that we could do significant reform within the constraints of the existing Constitution.
Okay. Mr. Berryhill has
just a comment. It would seem to me that the way that this system works today, I mean, as we sit here with the revenues that we've got coming in, we can't reform our way out of this thing. We can't, to reinvent government right now, in my opinion, I don't really think we have to do that. What we need to get is people working again. And that's real people with real jobs. And I think that at the end of the day and at the end of this hearing, that's what we're all going to be looking at. It's just a matter of having more revenues. We've had mandates that people hate taxes. Nobody likes to be taxed. We all get that part of it. But I think collectively, we as a body have to understand that we've got to put California back to work again. I think we all want California getting back to work again. As soon as we have those tax revenues back in here, we're going to be able to fund all these social programs, all the kids, all the education, everything else that we want to do. We all want that. Is there any shortcuts? You know, there's going to be no fast fix to this situation, at least in my opinion. I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the speakers to see what their thoughts are on this, because, you know, we're a couple years off from fixing this, and if we don't get people working again, we're not going to get out of this mess. And so I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, or if you even have a comment, but I don't. And do you agree that do you think that we can reform our way out of the situation that we're in today, given today's revenues?
Certainly, one of the major concerns of all Californians is the great hope that our economy recovers and more people can get jobs, and that will be of great benefit for all of the whole state.
I'd comment. We have had a number of comments. I think at the first hearing, just talking about, for instance, the California Revision Commission, and when they started, we were in not as bad, but a similar financial situation. And the reason, at least as told to us by members of the commission, Mr. Houck and others, was that by the time they came back with recommendations, the crisis had passed, so that there was no real motivation to change some of the systemic problems. I would suggest, and I agree with you, Mr. Berryhill, the ultimate thing is to get the economy going. But if you look at the top 10 list, I mean, this has been 100 years of trying to solve problems and respond to problems. Maybe there's an opportunity here. We've talked a lot of times, a lot of these hearings been discussion about outcomes. I mean, and when you think of outcomes, how can you develop an outcome-based budget when we control the revenues, but we give the programs, the service delivery is to someone else? Many of us used to be in those positions. And, you know, both of us as former businessmen, or me as a former and you as a current, how do you run a business when your revenue is controlled and has very little relationship with the actual service deliveries of the product? Seems to me a very crazy situation. Mr. Blakesley, did you still want to make a comment about the tax rate in San Francisco, or have you calmed down?
I just wanted to maybe add my voice to Tom's in terms of trying to be sure we understand the difference between sort of the cause of the tension versus the symptoms. You know, we're dealing with a tax code which is incredibly volatile, which produces these huge swings, times when we have more revenue than we anticipated. We saw that certainly before Prop 13, where, what was it, a $5 billion reserve was being built up, and then times when we're absolutely out of revenue. And we saw what happened with that with ERAF. And I would hazard a guess that it's this huge volatility we have, and an inability to either A, control spending through a spending cap, or B, have a rainy day fund to buffer those ups and downs, and that in the absence of addressing that fundamental question, this volatility will continue, and it will continue to hurt local government, even if you have various separation of source constitutional amendments, because it's basically those tremendous swings where you have revenue and don't have revenue that's producing the tensions. If we had stable revenue, or again, a spending cap or a rainy day reserve, there'd be much more certainty for all parties to be budgeting, and these formulas, frankly, would work probably pretty well.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Yes, Mr. Blumenfield.
Yeah, just kind of wanted to respond to what my colleague said and what you guys have said. Another issue that will keep government going is, or will get our economy back going, is faith in government. And I think what's important about this and the timing of this and how it's inextricably linked with jobs is the transparency factor. Right now, you know, people pay their local taxes. They don't know where it goes. the state has it, and as this illustrates, it's pretty circuitous route between the dollar that you pay and the service that you get. And one of my hopes with this reform is that we can shed some more put some more transparency into where the dollars are coming from and where they're going, and that will make people feel better about the investments that they make. And that's the way we're going to grow this economy, is by creating more jobs, but also investing in our infrastructure. And the only way that the public is going to do that is if they have more faith in government. And to me, some of the relationship between state and local funding is a key part of, fixing that is a key part of restoring people's faith in government.
Well said. All right. There are no other comments or questions. Thank you, Ms. O'Malley. We'll look forward to your response, and you can make that in the top 10 list if you'd like. I'll turn it over the next section to Mr. Feuer.
Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to start our panel on city and county perspectives on an array of realignment issues. I'm going to ask to come forward 7 panelists: Max Niemann, Tony Oliveira, Patricia Ryan, Frank Mecca, Chris McKenna, Jim Kennedy, and Bill Miller. As people assemble, in most cases, I think there are a couple representatives of, like the League of Cities, for example, and the counties. Otherwise, if folks can limit their presentations to 5 to 7 minutes each, we'll have the opportunity to have a good conversation with members of the committee if we do that. Why don't we begin as people get settled here? I think, are we one chair short, or are we okay? All right. Why don't we begin, please, with Mr. Niemann, who is a senior fellow with the PPIC.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some of my work, which is focused on local fiscal stress in the current climate in California. And I should say, in trying to chop this down as quickly as I can to 5 and 7 minutes, so I've got about 3 minutes I got to get rid of here real quickly in my head. So in any case, the state and local problem is a critical part of improving state government. There is this connection, of course, with how people think of the state, and in fact, managing the state and local fiscal relationship is part and parcel of managing the states. They're intertwined in ways that we are trying to unravel and redesign in a more beneficial way. And it's easy to become mired in many facets of reform, but here are the ones I'd focus on. Trying to focus on, first of all, some of the questions, particularly about accountability and trying to get the biggest bang for the reform buck here. And I think much of the, as was mentioned here, much of the local problem is driven by the state's financial problem. If you look at particularly since the 90s, the wild swings in state revenue have pretty much driven the crisis at the local level. And work that I've done, which I'll be happy to talk about if you're interested and have some questions about, and which I'll make available as soon as we're in production right now this week, and at any moment it will be available on our website, and I'll make sure that the members receive copies of it, and I'll get it to any of the interested parties. But it's very clear that local government, for example, was managing its fiscal crisis. It was tough. Very tough decisions were being made at the local level, analogous to those that are being made at the state level. People being laid off, furloughs, positions being eliminated, dipping into the reserve accounts, and so on. And the thing that, of course, makes it so difficult for local government is the wild card that the state constitutes. And as I point out, of course, is that I'm sympathetic to the constraints under which legislators operate. They're not ignorant about what's going on. Many of you are, as you've mentioned already, local legislators, local officials yourselves have experience in this regard, have tried to manage some of these problems over time. But nevertheless, the constraints you're operating under, in effect, constitutes an enormous wild card for local governments. They have to basically program into their budget making and strategic thinking this great deal of uncertainty about what it is the state is going to do. Now, ordinarily, this might not be a problem, except that since the 90s, we've had fairly quick all budgeting all the time, 24/7 in Sacramento. It's a budget cycle that seems to never end. As Dan Walters pointed out, we really are basically doing budgets for most of the time. Never mind how that saps the civic energy of everyone involved in trying to think about anything else. So I think dealing with the ERAF system is probably the major focus and number one target for me. Minimizing the fiscalization of land use and the privileged position that sales tax provides right now at the local level and related to jobs issues. Let's incentivize smart, balanced growth at the local level. And by the way, this brings a number of other things into the picture, including how we go about approving the formation of new communities. Well, you know, that isn't going to happen too often anymore, but nevertheless, small communities with a fair amount of undeveloped land, which are then devoted primarily to retail. Over the long haul, all of those communities are going to face problems as retail establishments become outmoded and succumb to the competition from neighbors or whatever. And I might say, too, that we really need to think very, very carefully about how we are actually going to come out of the current national as well as state economic malaise. Whether the housing industry ever, or at least within the foreseeable future, is ever going to recover in the way it operated before, whether consumer confidence and spending and credit availability, even if it recovers somewhat to get the economy going in some tolerable way. I don't think that's going to happen for quite a while. And how that affects retail sales, how that affects permits and fees, how that affects the turnover of land, all of which have been critical in enhancing the local tax base in the last 20 to 25 years. I think we need to have a closer look at that before we engage in anything really dramatic about how we go about resolving and reforming local finance. Perhaps the most difficult thing, but I think something that might be addressed in a long-term sort of way, is to permit local governments the option of moving away from Proposition 13 constraints. And I emphasize local government. Leave the state operate under Prop 13 requirements. Leave Prop 13 constraints as the default option, but permit local populations to decide for themselves whether they want to retain or replace or modify the current system's supermajorities for local decisions. Options should be designed in such a way that require retention of many of the constructive features of Prop 13, such as limiting growth in taxable assessments. I mean, Proposition 13 has produced some very positive consequences, which we now can understand, but we have to overcome the holy wars that erupt over every reexamination of Proposition 13. And I, of course, understand that for some people, Proposition 13 is a negative button. For others, it's a positive button. But it, like any piece of legislation, deserves to be looked at in a dispassionate way. It has had a damaging effect on local autonomy, and it has also, I think, violated the principle of like-situated households being treated equally. And so there are some things that can be done there, but it will take some doing. And I also suggest that we do have a protection. Someone has mentioned direct democracy here, and I think the key thing is that if we continue to have this kind of adversarial relationship between the state and local government and the ill will that seems to have emerged. My recent work has demonstrated, and by the way, my recent work really does demonstrate how badly these relations have deteriorated. Direct democracy then, I mean, local governments have joined in the general initiative industry game. Why shouldn't they? Everyone else has. And as a means of trying to protect themselves against what they perceive to be the threat from the state, we see yet more initiatives being proposed by a variety of groups to try to insulate local government from state actions. I think in the long run, that's not the way to do things. So I'm hopeful that we can develop a process that will involve localities in an ongoing, sustained way, bring them into the picture, recognizing full well that localities are winners and losers and aren't always don't always have a consensus about what they think is the right thing to do. Put some responsibility on local governments to share in the work and the responsibility for reform. and hopefully we can do better. I think we don't have a choice but to do better.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to Supervisor Oliveira.
And I will shorten mine also. Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairs and the committee. I am Tony Oliveira, Kings County Board of Supervisor. I'm the president of CSAC. And as it relates to this, is I'm also the finance chair for CalPERS as a board member, so I get to see the status of many local governments.
Not many people would admit that, but
but it does help give you a perspective of the current status. And then I just wanted to say that I mentioned at PERS all the time is that today, like in today's committee hearing, when we talk about them and us, it's really all of us, because unless you are incarcerated or deployed out of state, 100% of all Californians live in local government, and we need to remember that as we work together. We are the same. We are the common leaders and common citizens of California. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you the county perspective on the state-local relationship. More than any other level of government, counties face are linked to the state of the state. We are part of the state. We are a subunit. Counties, as you know, are the state's service provider in addition to providing municipal services in the unincorporated areas and countywide services required by law. We always welcome the opportunity to join in what seems to be the festival of reform that we are experiencing in the state. While we have plenty of concerns, I share also to discuss the county's concerns in the view of potential changes that can improve our relationship, and we believe how Californians served by government. If we're looking for true reform and make real improvements, I'm going to assume you are asking for our candid input. Counties and cities and special districts are known for that. So here it is. When it comes to the state-county relationship over the last decades, the term dysfunction doesn't quite cut it. Cuts, shifts, flips, swaps, deferrals, IOUs, and loans have so significantly deteriorated the relationship we share, it is difficult to imagine a worse kind of current partnership. Even in good economic times, counties cannot rely on the state to be reasonable, collaborative, straightforward, or responsive. But simply the state, in the eyes of counties currently, has been an untrustworthy partner. Since we are elected leaders in the environment in which the public is clamoring for greater accountability and responsibility from its government representatives, counties want to take this opportunity to seek a more functional relationship with a state that allows us to provide services to the public in an efficient and effective manner. If we let the opportunity pass, we will surely confirm the worst notions about our ability. Just as was mentioned over here, I've been a businessman for 40 years, and I agree that we have to restore jobs and build those back. But many business people out there are looking to us that they can rely on, that they can count on the rules, the laws. And it's very hard as a businessman right now, to be honest with you, to hire people back unless we see that the state and counties and cities get their own houses in order. In the current fiscal climate, there have been significant discussions about government revenues and the appropriateness of raising or reforming. Those conversations are all good ones. However, counties have a fundamental concern about the legislator's ability to, and frankly, inclination to undermine local revenues, whether it is through outright grabs, delays, deferrals, or other statutory changes. We know from experience that there are numerous opportunities to disrupt the flow of resources to local governments. The current state budget is a good example. Proposition 1A, barring significant delays and deferrals of transportation and health and human services funding, mandate suspicion and delays. Other proposals that would have eliminated certain transportation funding sources were gratefully not approved by the legislator, but certainly were on the table right up to the last minute. Counties work hard to be good fiscal stewards. We are making difficult decisions to manage the current fiscal environment, layoffs, furloughs, service cuts. We are setting priorities, managing state budgets, and balancing budgets. We are doing these things on time and in public. We suggest to you that we are the appropriate level of government to have the option to ask the voters to approve new revenues and to do that with a vote threshold that is lower than the current two-thirds requirement. We believe that this change will allow us to be responsive to our constituents and address local priorities in a reasonable manner. We also suggest that you consider an end, or at the very least, a pause to new mandates on local government. This is important for a few reasons. First, the state can ill afford the mandates that must eventually be funded. Second, there is a lack of adequate fiscal analysis prior to legislative approval of new mandates, resulting in a bit of shock and awe once the bill comes due. Finally, this year's budget suspends certain mandated programs and services, ones that have already been approved and funded. This scenario makes no sense. It means that local agencies will have to make the determination whether to stop performing the mandate or continue the mandate at its own cost. With great respect to the fiscal difficulty you face this year and will be facing again in deciding about the mandates, you will like us to do and then fund them. If you cannot afford to fund them, tell us to stop doing them and please stop approving new ones. In terms of improving the legislative budget process, we'll believe that the state's fiscal outlook could be greatly improved with some reasonable changes. I'll make just a few comments here in the end. Focus on oversight and review of state programs to ensure that programs and services are meeting the legislature's goals and objectives and are cost effective. Oftentimes, the legislature has limited information to how state departments have implemented budget cuts or program changes, or how local agencies are responding to the particular budget choice. We are more than willing to participate in such oversight hearings. We are, in fact, your partners. Open and public hearings that include input from interested parties and appropriate time for review of legislative proposals will help to reestablish trust between the public and the legislature. We recognize that this is a significant culture shift in how capital business is conducted, but we believe our input and the input of others can be helpful and important to consider when discussing certain budgets. I'll end with this one. State fiscal decisions should be made with a longer-term view and include prudent reserves that allow for appropriate funding of programs, while also ensuring that existing debts are paid in a timely manner. This is of particular importance to counties when we consider the state's ongoing failure to meet certain funding obligations in jointly funded health and human services programs for nearly a decade. Consider this along with the rapidly mounting state debts, prison overcrowding, and health issues, out-year obligations to schools under Proposition 98, and the sunset of temporary tax increases. It is difficult to fathom how you and us are ever going to have the resources necessary to right the ship without a long-term strategy to get the state's budget in balance. And then, from a personal note, which is the way I prefer to speak, is these are hard times, and I come back to the jobs. I really think the greatest message that we could send to our constituents right now is the cooperation, or a clear signal between local governments and the state. We have very experienced people. Most of you, well, actually all of you came from local government, regardless if you served as an elected official or not. And I think the expertise that we can put together and the partnership to solve these problems is really the answers to the California budget. As an economist, I can tell you that I am not a half-full glass guy right now. I think things are tough for a couple of years for California, and the best thing we could do is to cooperate as a team. We do have the greatest state. And then from my CalPERS chair, I will tell you this. I'm also the risk chair. And when we look at all the risk and all the losses in any pension fund or any business out there, we didn't lose it from local government. We didn't lose it from the state. It came from the business world. I come from the business world. And the business world takes a lot of risk, but local governments have always been there for us. Our county's been around almost 100 years, and will be around another 100 years. So local governments are a great risk partner for the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. The candor is extremely welcome in this setting in particular. Patricia Ryan, who's the Executive Director of the California Mental Health Directors Association. Welcome.
Thank you. I guess it's pretty easy to figure out which one I am, female on this panel.
I was confused, but thank you for clarifying that for me.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I am Patricia Ryan, the Executive Director of the California Mental Health Directors Association, which represents local mental health directors in all 58 counties and 2 city local directors. I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you our perspective on the state-local relationship, which I must truthfully tell you, in my view, has never been as dysfunctional, distrustful, and unpredictable as it is now. As you know, counties are the service provider for community mental health services in California. We believe that even amidst the chaos and the dysfunction of our current fiscal and policy environment in this state, county mental health departments have consistently done a remarkable job in keeping systems going with a focus on transforming services to assure that individuals in our communities can recover from their mental illness. Realignment of community mental health programs from the state and the counties, which occurred in 1992, was very successful from the standpoint of providing a predictable source of money to counties with the flexibility to serve individuals where they live in the communities. It has not been so successful over time, however, because of changing policies, eroding revenues, and other issues that I'll touch on a little bit today. What has been good about realignment is that the dedicated revenue source and increased flexibility allowed financial stability and appropriate incentives that allow counties to make a long-term investment in mental health infrastructure. And they did that for many years. They actually created, for the first time, they built an infrastructure. They were able to put aside what you called prudent reserves. We called realignment trust funds for those times when revenues might dip a little bit. Those realignment trust funds are gone in virtually every county in the state and have been for several years. But it gave counties the ability still to have at least outside of the state budget a predictable revenue source that they could predict based on the economy from year to year. The emphasis on our clear mission and defined target population, which was also established during realignment, has allowed counties to develop comprehensive community-based systems of care for individuals with serious mental illness and serious emotional disturbance. It has also allowed us to institute best practices, emphasize community-based rather than institutional care, which is more costly and restrictive, and to focus on promoting recovery. Lessons learned from realignment. I could spend 2 hours literally talking about the complications of our current community-based mental health system, and I do hope that someday you'll hold a hearing on that system by itself. But the lessons learned that I wanted to bring here today are a few. They are that changes to the revenue streams and statutes affecting the original realignment agreement can, over time, and do and have significantly eroded the original purpose of realignment. We've seen this with both the original realignment, which was in 1992, particularly related to the addition of and changes to the in-home supportive services program, which affected the caseload social services account growth, which then resulted in virtually no growth for the mental health account. And we've also seen changes in policy due to the Medi-Cal specialty mental health managed care consolidation, which we kind of look at as a second unofficial realignment, because over time the state has shifted the fiscal responsibility from the state to counties for managing the Medi-Cal mental health program, which is an entitlement program, and the community-based mental health services that were funded through realignment were never meant to be an entitlement program. So more and more over time, as realignment revenues erode, more and more of county realignment revenues are being used to match Medi-Cal, and so it's become a very complicated system. County if I can't not mention Prop 63 and the Mental Health Services Act, because I'm sure it's at the top of all of your minds and you're wondering why or how that's affected the community mental health system. I will tell you that without the Mental Health Services Act, we would be in dire circumstances in our community mental health system. We would be able to provide nothing more than acute inpatient services in order to keep the community safe, and that would be about it. If it hadn't been for the revenues that MHSA brought in, along with that new revenue source come additional complications, of course, and lots of bureaucracy, which I could also talk to you a lot about. But I think based on a chart that I just saw recently that the Oversight and Accountability Commission for the Mental Health Services Act produced, we are now or will be next year at the same place financially in our community-based mental health system if you take into consideration the cost of living or the cost of providing medical services as we were in 2003 and 2004. If you take into consideration the state reductions, the reductions in Prop 63 revenues, which are going to go down by half, or have gone down by half, the erosion of realignment revenues, which have also been reduced, are not only not growing anymore, but for mental health, they've actually been reduced. All that having been said, I think the people that I represent are amazing people. They respond and react to change very quickly, and they keep their eye on the ball, and what they are interested in doing is serving their communities to the best of their ability with the resources that they have available. If there's one thing that I think that realignment, the original realignment, didn't do well enough, and frankly the legislature hasn't done a very good job of making sure that they do, is develop a set of outcomes measures and hold the state and the counties accountable to those outcomes measures. I can tell you that the county mental health departments would welcome, we would like to be part of the development of those measures because we are the community mental health system. We would welcome the development of statewide outcomes measures that would be measured and that would be looked at by the legislature and the state, and really create a continuous quality improvement system in the community mental health system. So I think there are lots of things. I would welcome you to look at all of the different funding streams of community mental health. I would tell you that counties are very functional, that the state is not very functional when it comes to the community-based mental health system, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for getting efficiencies in the current system that we have and making sure that we do the best with the money that we have available to us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ryan. Frank Mecca is the Executive Director of the County Welfare Directors Association of California. Mr. Mecca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I am Frank Mecca. I'm the Executive Director of the County Welfare Directors Association. We're the statewide association of California's 58 county human service agencies. There's so much to say about the state-county relationship, as my colleagues before me have indicated. I'll focus today on the experience that we had with the 1991 realignment legislation, which is basically the core legislation that defines the fiscal relationship between the state and the counties for human services, and hopefully give you some lessons learned from that experience that might guide your future deliberations. I think the first point that we'd like to make and underscore is that realignment really means different things depending on the program or service that's being discussed. The original sort of conception of realignment was find the proper level of government to perform a service for citizens and then identify the appropriate revenue source. Give that level of government the authority to levy that revenue source and hold that level of government accountable for the outcomes that they achieve. And for some programs, that conception of realignment, where you put the program or service in the appropriate governmental box, was how it worked. For example, for at least part of the community mental health program, largely that was the philosophy behind realignment. For social services programs, however, that really isn't the nature of the realignment legislation. In fact, our programs fit neatly into both boxes. Almost all of the social services programs in the state involve a significant state role and a significant county role. The programs that we administer are many, but they fall into public assistance and employment, CalWORKs, child protection and adoptions, foster care, and we administer the in-home supportive services program, the large entitlement program for elderly and disabled. And we administer many other programs as well, but the programs fall into those categories. Generally and largely speaking, these programs are either federally mandated or authorized. they're state supervised, but they're county administered. And I think it was Marianne O'Malley in her very excellent overview that talked about the genesis of county administration. And I'd just like to say, sort of in corroboration of what Pat Ryan said, we think that decision close to 100 years ago was a wise one. And we think we actually, having services administered as closest to the people as possible makes sense. But these are programs where the federal government holds the state accountable, in many cases for statewide requirements. In many cases, there are legal and statutory rules that require statewide application, and these are, to a large extent, federally derived. Legislatures over the years, the California legislature over the years has found it fit to add many, many more of its own rules and requirements and angles to social services programs. And so inevitably our programs involve a significant role for the state and a significant role for locals. So what the realignment legislation did in 1991 wasn't really substantially change the governance or the programmatic relationship of these programs. It changed the relative responsibility for paying for them. What it did was change the sharing ratios between the state and the counties for these programs. So, for example, prior to realignment, the county share of a foster care payment was 5% of the non-federal costs. The realignment legislation changed that to 60% of the non-federal costs. So the state's share went from 95 to 40. So you might be asking, so what was the incentive? If it wasn't about changing the programmatic relationship, why change the sharing ratios in realignment? And I'll tell you sort of quite bluntly, the goal in 1991 was to find additional costs that could be shifted to local governments that could then be used to, that would then be funded with new revenues that were being raised. It was Governor Wilson who originally proposed the realignment of mental health. Between the January budget that was proposed and moving toward the May revise, the state budget deficit in that year mushroomed to proportionately, I think I've heard some people say greater than the one you're facing, but certainly close. And the legislature and the Wilson administration agreed that additional revenue needed to be raised, and I believe the number went to $2.2 billion at the time. And after realigning mental health programs and health programs, there were additional costs that needed to be transferred to local government, given the revenue sources that had been identified on a bipartisan basis as worthy of being levied. And so the legislature decided that we should look at the social services programs as a potential place to shift costs from the state to the locals. And that's what happened. In virtually all of the social services programs, the sharing ratio between the state and the locals changed. The goal clearly was to facilitate the raising of the additional revenue. But the secondary goal was, and it's not to be completely dismissed, was to try to affect local behavior, county behavior in these programs by changing fiscal incentives. It was the belief that when the counties only paid 5% of the non-federal share of a foster care grant, it was too easy for the county to remove a child from a home and put that child in foster care rather than work with that home to try to see if the child we could avoid removal. I remember during the debates there were some that proposed that the county share of foster care should be 90% because they believed we should avoid at all costs removing children and do everything we can to keep them at home. The legislature viewed that as a fiscal incentive that was overly dangerous because it would give counties the incentive to leave children in harmful situations. So the legislature landed on 60%. And that type of analysis went into each one of our programs. Certainly more art than science, but not without rationale. And I just think it's important to underscore that this really wasn't a change in the nature of the programmatic relationship between the state and the counties. It really was a fiscal transaction. So pluses and minuses, or challenges and opportunities. I say that facetiously. I hate that taxonomy. The pluses, the additional revenue brought into the state clearly took pressure off the general fund and clearly obviated the need for deep cuts that clearly would have fallen disproportionately in the social services arena. I make that assessment based on my view of history and looking at the type of constitutional and other types of political protections that other sectors of the budget enjoyed that weren't and continue not to be enjoyed by social services. So that clearly was a benefit of realignment. And some would argue, and I think I would agree to some extent, that the changed ratios and the modifying of the financial incentive did actually result in some programs in programmatic behavior changes that were to the benefit of the programs. The challenges. The revenue sources are completely countercyclical to demand in social services. Our programs go up precisely at the time that any revenue source is going to tank. And so there's an incredible sort of dissonance in the notion of realigning social services when it's probably the sector where you'll have the most dangerous counter-cyclical effect of the revenue source. The second challenge is that future legislatures can and do change the rules and have the counties holding the bag. IHSS was realigned, and the counties went from a fairly small fixed share of cost in the IHSS program to a 35% share of all non-federal costs. The program that was realigned was a minimum wage program where there was no collective bargaining required in the program. Now, regardless of what you think about the wisdom of that setup, and many of my members believe that it wasn't programmatically sound, financially, that was the program that was realigned to the counties. The counties got a 35% share of that program, and we kind of had to live within the revenue source to pay for the costs. Now, certainly demography has driven costs, driven up the caseload in this program. It is an incredibly cost-effective program, but the legislature made a huge change in the advent of collective bargaining that I think has improved the quality of the IHSS program. But when the legislature made that change, the funding source didn't go up. We didn't get additional revenues, even though the state has sort of changed the rules of the game midstream. And we don't have a very good way in the realignment construct to protect ourselves from changes to the rules made by subsequent legislatures.
And Mr. McKay, it's a great presentation. If you could wind it down.
I'll wrap it up. In the interest of time, should we do more sort of realignment in the social services arena? I don't know that there's a compelling policy argument for modifying sharing ratios. There are some that might argue that there is in the CalWORKS program. If you do, I think we have to deal in some way with the countercyclical nature of the revenue source, either with a general fund backstop or some type of funding trigger. And I think we have to work together to find a better way to protect local governments from changes to the rules of the program made after the financial relationship is set in statute.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Chris McKenna, the Executive Director of the California League of Cities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm actually Chris McKenzie.
Oh, McKenzie, excuse me. Forgive me.
I like the name McKenna. I know.
Let me try that again.
I know that wasn't intentional. I'm going to stray and be very, very brief because I think there's been some great points made. We ought to enshrine Mary Ann's 10-point thing. We can joke about it, but it's excellent. And that's a story we all ought to learn and we shouldn't forget. I think we're sort of at a position right now where we're like a 100-year-old fire service. We're trying to put out a fire in a building with a series of buckets. And you know what? We know when we start it's going to be inadequate, and we know when it ends it's going to be inadequate. So we've got some very short-term triage we've got to do, and we've got some longer-term institution building that we have to do. So I think whatever you do, you ought to approach it from that standpoint. First of all, I can't agree with Tom Berryhill more and others who agreed with him. Economic stability, job creation is our joint effort. Tony mentioned it, Max mentioned it, we all know it. But we are, and I'll take responsibility as a Californian, but I know who cast the votes. We're doing things in our state budget and sometimes with our local budgets that destroy jobs. and we first ought to examine what we're doing that destroy jobs, whether it's public sector jobs or private sector jobs. The federal government is pouring boatloads of money into the unemployment system when all of us know those people need to get back to work. And with due respect to my friend Max, who wants to address the whole land use and sales tax problem, most of us would be glad to have jobs in the retail sector today because it's a job. And retail jobs are not to be looked down upon. They're very, very important. So I would suggest that all of us need to get to work at creating economic stability for our state, and that ought to be job one for all of us. Secondly, sort of the underlying theme of every time our Ledge Director Dan Carrick's here, occasionally I come over, and by the way, our President Robin Lowe would be here, but she had an encounter with a Christmas tree and a ladder.
Yeah, the tree won, I understand.
And the tree won, and the ladder won, and she sends her regrets, but I know she feels very passionate about this, and our members do. Quite frankly, our agenda at the League generally is to get you to leave us alone. Because we have shown time and time again, and I think Max referred to this, that we can innovate, we can use the revenues we have to achieve success, and a lot of our focus is on job creation and job retention. But we are constantly looking over our shoulder at a state government that, quite frankly, is trying to use our reserves. Some of the best fiscal management in our state is being done at the city and the county level. The state, without retaining or creating a reserve, is basically, and with these laws that still allow or arguably allow you to take local revenues, allows you to treat local reserves as the state reserves. Now, I'll stipulate you've got a troubled relationship with the federal government, but if the federal government could come in and take your income tax, if they could come in and take your sales tax the way you have intercepted local revenues, you would find that to be untenable. And so we have to attack that, but I can't underscore enough how important it is that we stop doing the things that are destroying growth in our state and that we focus on how to get back there. So one of the ways that we're working on it, and some of you I know aren't going to agree with this, but I want to tell you what we're doing. When it became clear this year that the legislature, until the last 2 hours, and thank you those of you, especially in the Assembly, who got involved in stopping this effort, we're going to try to intercept the highway users tax and take it and use it to pay off the state's bonds. I understood that short-term need to do that. But the problem is you were going to put thousands of local workers out of jobs. You were going to put thousands of employees of contractors out of jobs. So we took that experience and we learned from it. We thought it was unthinkable that you would even think of doing it in this economy because it was going to take $1 billion out of infrastructure and use it to pay some of your ongoing obligations. Again, thank you very much for not doing it. But we know the risk is there. So we sat down with our counterparts at the Alliance for Jobs. We sat down with our counterparts at the Transit Association, which has seen billions of dollars taken out of transit operations just when we need to get people to their jobs. We're cutting transit services dramatically. We're raising fares. We're doing all the things in this economy that are not helping our recovery. And we said, could we really tolerate this unpredictability anymore? We concluded that we couldn't, and we drafted a ballot measure. We have filed it. We're going to get title and summary on it in a couple of days. And it's going to address, we believe, the major sources not only of the unpredictability in local government, but also the economic weaknesses that we're creating by these budgeting practices. It's going to further protect the highway users tax and make sure it has to be used for transportation. You can change the shares in the future, but you'd have to hold public hearings. The CTC would, and you'd get to make the decision. But you couldn't do it overnight. It's going to take away the ability to borrow those revenues because we've seen, as in the case of the Prop 1A borrowing, I tell you, it worked barely. And in 3 years, you got to pay it back. And I think that's bad long-term for the state to do it. So it's going to eliminate the borrowing of the transit funds, the property tax, the highway users tax, and the Prop 42 funds, and make it very clear they can't be diverted. And it's also going to further protect redevelopment. You're going to hear from my colleague at the Redevelopment Association about the number of jobs we're destroying by taking the money out of redevelopment. So I want to tell you, we're willing to work with you on these ideas, other ideas, but I'm trying to communicate. I think I have some desperation, and I know you feel it. We're seeing cities lay off more and more employees, devastating services to deal with this economy. We can't have state government visiting its problems on local government. At the same time, we want to help state government get back on its feet. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. Let's turn now to Jim Kennedy, the director of the Contra Costa County Development Association and the current president of the California Redevelopment Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Chair. It's always a pleasure to be in the same room with former County Supervisor Mark DeSaulnier. It was a pleasure to work with him then.
Your time's up, Mr. Kennedy.
Okay.
I'm not coming back, so you don't have to say nice things.
In the interest of time, I've paired my remarks as well, and I'll make 5 points. The first one of which is redevelopment agencies in California collectively administer the state's economic development programs, bringing investment and jobs to our local communities. Let me just give you a few facts. $40.8 billion. That was redevelopment's contribution to the California economy in fiscal year 07. 303,900 full and part-time jobs. That's what redevelopment created again in fiscal year 07. $2 billion in state and local taxes were generated through redevelopment construction activities in fiscal year 07. And since 1995, we've been responsible for the production of over 78,000 affordable housing units in California. But beyond the numbers, redevelopment is also about cleaning up blighted and rundown communities, reviving our downtowns, improving the environment by cleaning up contaminated sites, reducing sprawl and reducing our carbon footprint, and helping to reduce crime. Those are all part and parcel of what redevelopment agencies do on a regular basis. We're not suggesting realignment either. Chris's words were just leave us alone. We think we are an economic development engine that, if left to do their work, will do good things for the state of California. My second point, California's economy is in the worst shape since the Great Depression, and the state's trying to eliminate the only local economic development stimulus program that exists. Redevelopment is about jobs. The legislature and the governor have approved the take of $2.05 billion in redevelopment revenues. Those are locally generated tax dollars. If those funds could be invested today, our econometric analysis suggests that 198,000 full and part-time jobs in the construction and related industries could be created in California. The law that has been approved by the state is a jobs killer. This is at a time when California has an unemployment rate in excess of 12%, and unemployment within the construction trades is over 30%. Let me just step aside and give you the sort of local experience. I'm the redevelopment director in Contra Costa County. We have two major examples of where we have used this tool to fuel significant job creation. The first is the Contra Costa Center Transit Village program. It's a transit-oriented development program around the Pleasant Hill BART station in central Contra Costa County. It's one of the best examples of transit-oriented development that you can see here in the state, and I would argue in the country. Agency investment of approximately $100 million to date has created private investment in excess of $900 million. Today, Contra Costa Center has 6,000 employees, 6,000 residents, and 6,000 BART patrons that come through that area every day. All of these uses are within a quarter of a mile of the BART fare gates. There are three things that I've heard in the discussion thus far that I think are replicated in the Contra Costa Center model. First is the imperative for infrastructure to set the basis for job growth. That's what we did in the early and mid-1980s under the vision and leadership of another former county supervisor who you'll hear from, Sonny McPeak. Secondly, it's the power of partnerships. our investment fueled private investment at a factor of 9 to 1. And that's what our econometric analysis suggests happens with all redevelopment monies. And the third, and from my standpoint, probably the most important thing, the business structure that we used in doing the Contra Costa Center Transit Village project is going to create a revenue asset for the county for the next 100 years that will be approaching $1 billion that it will be able to use for health, human services, and for criminal justice programs that they're mandated to carry out. So it will be an enhancement to what its core function is as a county. The second example is in North Richmond, where we had a firm that was ready to move to Nevada. It's a home accessories manufacturer, Palachek, that was housed in Richmond. It had outgrown its facilities and it was ready to move. With $500,000 of investment on the part of the agency, we were able to induce $12 million of investment on the part of the firm to acquire, renovate, and re-equip an old, vacant, dilapidated industrial facility that now is their world headquarters. The third point, redevelopment can help the state, redevelopment can help local government meet the goals of AB 32 and SB 375. Redevelopment is used to replace, rehabilitate crumbling infrastructure in already developed areas, which is critical to maximizing our ability to do infill development. It cleans up contaminated properties, reduces urban sprawl, it builds housing, affordable housing, closer to where people work, closer to transit, and thus it reduces vehicle miles traveled. Going back to our Contra Costa Center experience, our studies indicated that simply by people choosing to locate near transit, their carbon footprint is reduced by 25%. Number 4, taking local redevelopment revenues is illegal. The authority to use tax increment funds, as you heard earlier, is in the state constitution. Tax increment shall be allocated to redevelopment agencies to pay indebtedness incurred by the agency to finance the redevelopment project. That's the state constitution. A key word in there is indebtedness. An agency must have formal debt, contractual debt to receive its revenues. The state's diversion of those revenues undermines that contractual relationship. Last year, CRA sued the state of California and we won for attempting to take $350 million from agencies. The state constitution hasn't changed since that time. This year's budget has a $2.05 billion take. We don't think that's right. My fifth point, I think it's important that the state, rather than having an adversarial relationship with redevelopment, really take the extra step and embrace it and promote it. Now more than ever, the state needs to support the mission of redevelopment. We would encourage partnerships with the state and with redevelopment. Redevelopment is all about investing local dollars to build safe, vibrant, healthy, and sustainable communities and to create jobs. Let me just close with a quote from San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed, who the other day was asked by the Mercury News to indicate what was on his Christmas wish list in keeping with the holiday season. What San Jose needs are funds to provide critical services in the midst of the worst economic downturn in decades. We could start with winning the lawsuit against the state that would prevent it from taking $75 million from our redevelopment agency that would go to rebuilding our economy and creating jobs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Our final speaker before we turn to committee questions and observations is Bill Miller, the General Manager of the North of the River Municipal Water District, the Board President of the Tehachapi Resource Conservation District, and past President of the California Special Districts Association. Mr. Miller, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. And I'm here speaking on behalf of the California Special Districts Association. I was also one of the 2 special district negotiators during the crafting of Proposition 1A and have been involved with special districts for 31 years. The California Special Districts Association represents over 1,000 independent special districts and affiliated organizations throughout the state and is the recognized voice for all special districts whose constituents, as you know, are also your constituents. It is interesting that the title of this hearing is Moving Government Closer to the People, because that precisely describes special districts. We are the government closest to the people.
I'm not sure your microphone is amplifying your speech.
Okay. How do you?
Yeah, maybe just speak closer. There you go.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We're the government closest to the people, providing focused services that a local community wants and needs and have organized for themselves to have provided. As elected officials, we hear a lot about efficiency and effectiveness, how to deliver services and build infrastructure quickly and at high quality, but also at the best price possible for our constituents. To achieve that, we need the legislature to give us the tools and the flexibility to decide which tools to use to get these projects delivered efficiently and effectively. As an example, special districts need to have the authority to use design-build contracting as appropriate and where it makes sense. Cities and counties already have this ability, and special districts need it as well. Design-building contracting is a proven way local governments can save money on infrastructure projects where it makes sense. Another tool special districts can use to save money is working through the public-private partnerships, or P3. Projects for which P3 can be used should be expanded and barriers to their use taken down. Not only can P3 potentially save special districts and their constituents money, but also stimulate private business and contribute to the economy of the state. And every dollar saved through the design, build, or P3 is a direct benefit to our communities and constituents that we, as legislators and directors of special district boards, serve in these fiscally and economically unstable times. The drop in property tax revenues has impacted many special district services as much as cities and counties. While we do not have cumulative data yet, surveys of our member districts have evidence that many non-enterprise special districts, which depend almost solely upon property taxes, such as fire protection districts and park and recreation districts, have been severely impacted by the housing and economic crisis. Our members that are enterprise districts are also being faced with similar pressures and impacts. Like the state, many districts are facing large deficits and have been forced to let go of staff, including public safety, or put staff on furloughs. This directly impacts our ability to provide crucial services at the local level. With all of this said, we believe the state can help. The state can help stabilize the revenue streams for special districts and help ensure services and much-needed infrastructure projects have enough money. I offer you 3 ideas to consider. The first is to provide clarification of Proposition 218. We're not asking to overturn Prop 218, but I think we can all agree that the initiative was badly written and has had unintended consequences. Over the last several years, there have been numerous lawsuits and court decisions in regards to Prop 218 because of the ambiguity of the law. Ultimately, this cost districts and other local governments significant amounts of money in litigation, among other areas. We believe a clear-cut policy should be established and streamlined by the legislature and a broad group of stakeholders, not by half a dozen court decisions. Second, local governments need local control of their finances to minimize cuts to public safety and other vital services. Part of this is once again loosening the reins that the state has over local government's property tax revenues, an unintended consequence of Proposition 13. The state must stop balancing its budget upon the backs of special districts, cities, and counties, whether it's through taking, borrowing, or otherwise. Facing large state budget deficits in 1992, the state shifted property tax money away from local governments to the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund, or ERAF. To date, special districts have lost over $6.8 billion in property tax shifts since ERAF 1 and 2 were first implemented, and including the $3.6 billion taken with ERAF 3. While we understand that asking the legislature to stop the ERAF shifts altogether during these difficult times is unrealistic, we do feel that keeping revenues meant for local communities should be a significant priority in the long term in order to meet the service needs of constituents locally. In addition to the ongoing ERAF 1 and 2 shifts this fiscal year, the state borrowed property tax money from local governments, and we continue to have to defend local government revenues from state raids. In part, it's the unknown of what is going to happen each year, or how local governments will be impacted that has paralyzed infrastructure developments and service delivery for special districts. CSDA supports strengthening constitutional language to keep all local revenues local and prevent the state from shifting any local money to the state or any other political entity. Shifting property tax revenues and any other local revenues away from special districts ultimately results in raids upon our citizens, with either higher fees for the same level of service or cuts to vital services, including public safety and health, all that benefit the people of California. Finally, another aspect of local control of finances and having the ability to maintain vital services like fire protection and integral infrastructure projects at a time when state services and funding are declining. To that end, we encourage you to support Assembly Constitutional Amendment 9 by Assembly Member Jared Huffman. This bill gives voters the ability to decide whether to change the 2/3 vote requirement for special local taxes and general obligation bonds to 55%, making it consistent with the requirement for school bonds. This would empower local governments to still be able to maintain their services as directed and funded by their constituents, and empower local voters to take action, but still strikes the right balance by requiring a greater than majority vote threshold and accountability standards. Ultimately, these ideas and solutions I'm offering today are about local government autonomy and providing the flexibility and security necessary to further move and keep government closer to the people, as stated in the title of this hearing. The state can help by empowering special districts with tools and flexibility to get projects completed quickly and saving constituents money, while providing districts with financial stability. CSDA is happy to talk to your staff more about these specific proposals and provide examples. We're always available as a resource. And on behalf of CSD and our members, I thank you for this opportunity to provide our thoughts. And I'd like to provide you with one of my own, similar to my supervisor colleague. Is that when I first started off in this business, one of the directors on the board once told me that just because you have the authority to do something doesn't mean necessarily follow that it's the right thing to do. And so as we go through this untangling, realigning, reallocating, shedding, whatever's going to, however this is all going to end up, please don't be leaving local government with another bag of responsibilities while the state takes off with another bag of money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Provocative discussion so far. Members of the committee, questions or comments? Mr. Berryhill.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for sharing their thoughts with us today. I'm going to kind of try to lump this into a couple different categories here to keep it as brief as I can. And this first comment is kind of on the local folks, Tony, Chris, Jim, and Bill. You know, I really think that these mandates, unfunded mandates for these local governments are absolutely crippling, not only the local governments, but ultimately this state. And I think the sooner that we can get done and get those things out of the way, the better off everybody would be. If we were to cut the small business sector loose through tax incentives, through enterprise zones, through not stealing redevelopment money, we would put, and there's no quick fix to this stuff, don't get me wrong, there's no silver bullet to where we're at today. But if you cut these folks loose, the real people that bring the real revenues into state government, we would have money for all these social services, and I want to talk to Frank and Patricia about that. We're looking at cutting, what, another $25 billion in this next budget. Devastating. So what does this come down to? It comes down to priorities. Where are we going to cut? You know, where can we cut? Where can't we cut? What's going to get cut is social services. Why? Because there is no money, and it's going to become that or public safety. Well, you know, when mom and the kids, they have to be safe when going to school and when going to the store. And so we, as a body, tough decisions. Are we going to steal from you guys in local government? Yeah, that's probably going to happen again. We fought those battles this last time. We'll be right back there again. Make no mistake about that. Why? Because we can. I mean, the statement about what would happen if the feds could do this, we wouldn't be very happy as a state if that were the case. So, you know, or there isn't any magic wand that anybody can wave in this room today on reform or anything else. Yeah, there's tweaks that we can do, but ultimately it's getting the regulatory burden off off of the small business guys to put them back to work again. We in this building here don't do anything for real tax revenues in this state. It's real people doing real jobs, creating real long-term sustainability. And as we move forward into this next very tough budget year, we've got to look towards the private sector pulling us out of this thing, and that's why we should be throwing our arms around anything that will create jobs as we move forward, and it won't be until then that we get out of this mess, because we have to grow out of it.
Thank you, Mr. Berryhill. Ms. Woke.
Thank you. I have a question for Frank Mecca. Frank, you did mention the interaction between federal funding, state, and local. I have a question for you. Do you think it's possible at all to do away with the state as the middle person in any of the services that are essentially passed down to the county?
In the social services arena, very few. And if they are, they're pretty small dollar amounts. They're some small categorical block grant programs, but the big programs where the big money are, the feds have been, and I would imagine under any circumstances will continue to expect the state to be the entity that they interact with and to enforce whatever federal rules are on a statewide basis. There are a handful of smaller programs that we administer that are not federally mandated, but in some cases they were mandated by the state, but as entitlement programs. For example, the CAPI program and the CFAP program. They were programs that you created when the federal government stopped aiding legal immigrants with food stamps and SSI. And so theoretically, there's that's a program where there's no sort of federal mandate, but clearly there's a state expectation that that's an entitlement that occurs regardless of the county that you live in. So in our area, there's not a whole lot of juice, I would think, in that squeeze.
Thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I just want to, because this has been an excellent panel and discussion, and someone coming from local government, as many of us have, and please don't think I'm pandering to the panel, but we in the state should be ashamed of ourselves. I mean, over the history, and certainly looking at the top 10 that was presented to us by Ms. O'Malley a little while ago, and looking at the changes that have occurred throughout that, we've continued to change the game as it's gone along, and generally to the disadvantage of local government in one form or another. And that's here again, looking at the shame shouldn't be with this legislature as much as those in the past who have really created. That was a good one, thanks. I thought you'd appreciate that, Mark. But it's because they created the framework that we're talking about here, and that framework that is part of that top 10 and kind of the history that we have created with the convoluted funding structure that's in place. And that's been, I think, created the financial course that the state has been on for the past 30 or 40 years at the minimum, and the fact that the state has not created a reserve mentality. I mean, that's something that I look at as crucial. The county that I came from, we had on $1.5 billion budget about a $200 to $300 million reserve that we've been able to accumulate. Now, state government looks at that and says, well, that looks good, and we could take that and use it for something. But to me, it shows responsibility and looking for that day when we need those resources, which is something that whether it's term limits or some other reason, we have not done that in state government. We've not been able to account for those days when we would need the resources. So, as I look at this, what I hear is local government wants stability, just as business wants stability. As they look at, just tell us what the rules are, we'll follow the rules, and we'll move forward. And I think that's what local government is looking for: stability, just as business does. And and they can do that when we look at programs, and Frank is correct. I mean, look at the IHSS program and the federal funding, the state funding, and then who is the actual employer, but the person receiving the service. It's a very complex program that needs a lot of I think tweaking to make it correct. But what I find is that the counties still should continue to provide the services, as we've found that they almost have to with the partnership. But we need to give them the resources, whatever those resources are, and then we should get out of the way. Get out of the way and let them handle the job. Do it with certainly with the outcome, the clear requirements that are necessary, and then establish clear outcomes and measurements that are necessary to be able to manage that and monitor it, and then leave them alone to do it. I think that's one of the things that I'm going to look for in this process, and certainly doing something to change the supermajority requirement. Here again, if I live in a community, I should be able, with a majority vote, to make the changes to provide whatever services I desire in that community. And it shouldn't be a two-thirds requirement, and it should be, whether it's 55% or 50% or majority is fine, but allow them to do that, and certainly avoid the mandates that we've been requiring in the past, and we need to certainly provide the oversight and review of the local programs, but that would be done in the accountability aspect of it. So I really think that there are ways to resolve this conflict between us, and a lot of that is for the state to look at our house and keep it in order, and not try to continually affect yours, and that's what we've been doing over the years. So.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. By the way, this is a panel that especially appreciates pandering. So, yeah.
I thought as much. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, other members of the committee with questions? Well, I'm going to make an observation at this point. You know, it was interesting. There was a moment in the panel discussion when I was prepared, when it came my turn, to say, so is there a consensus on this panel that the best we could do is, just in the words of the panelists, leave us alone? But then I've heard other things too. I've heard some express that view. I've heard others say, alleviate some of the pressures created by the supermajority requirement. I think it's fair to say, Mr. Neiman, if I think I get this right, your recommendation wasn't necessarily to go down the path that Mr. Huffman's ACR goes down, which is to say 55%, but I think I heard you to say allow local jurisdictions to vote to decide what the vote threshold should be in their community, which is an interesting iteration on this theme of local control that I haven't heard before. I heard, of course, the recommendation that we modify Prop 218. So I'm interested in getting a little more conversation from the panel. Is it really just leave us alone? Is it clearly everyone on the panel is saying, don't take our money. Everyone on the panel is saying, don't rely on local government to solve your problems at the state level, and for goodness sakes, don't impose mandates that we have to pick up the nickel for. Those things we've heard. Is there consensus for more than just leave us alone among the panelists? I'm curious.
Let me just very quickly say, because I think others probably can weigh in a little bit better than I can. I think it's a little more than just leave us alone, because what I think we're seeing, at least from the data and the report that I did, is that locals feel they are making the very tough choices they have to make in this kind of an environment. They are doing very, very tough things, in many cases cutting services, laying people off. Perhaps the reserve issue is one that really rubs many respondents to the work that I've done. Is they accumulate in almost all cases prudent reserves at the local level for exactly these kinds of exigencies, and what they deeply resent. As a matter of fact, is the fact that the state has obviously not done that, and they feel that it seems to me that they feel that had the state been doing this in a consistent sort of way, that some of the pressure, beyond leaving locals alone, would be off. So I think it goes beyond just leave us alone. There is a strong feeling there's some things the state could be doing, particularly on the reserve side, to alleviate these sort of paroxysms of raids as they see it.
Yeah, and let me say, but just a little more framing of the question. Of course, our initial presenter was making very clear how Byzantine, how perhaps not particularly rational the history has been as to how we got here. Mr. Desaulniers said maybe it is like adding another layer of paint one after another, and pretty soon you have kind of a mess of a paint job. So clearly there are some elements in the current relationship that at least some people have said really ought to change a lot. And the panel is going to face, the committee is going to face very soon the decision whether to embark on untangling the knot or to do rather little and leave you alone. So that's the spirit of the question. It's a very practical one, which invites some specificity in response. Please.
Mr. Chair, first of all, I think from a CSAC point of view and as a county supervisor, one of the greatest investment that California has, to be honest with you, are you folks. We are against the term limits because we need you to gather. You remember the days of being down at the county. I've been there 11 years. I've been 19 years as elected official. I'm a 62-year-old doctoral student in public policy, and I'm just beginning to understand what this is all about.
You're a quick study.
Yeah. We need you folks. We need you folks to be here longer and develop the expertise that you need to help run the state. This is a very, one of the largest economies in the world. So term limits needs to be modified in some fashion to allow the expertise that you have and develop. The local tax issue, I think, is a major thing. What was talked about, mandates, that's a very immediate thing. The only thing that's more immediate than to stop the mandates or give us relief there is that it's a very wet year. Frank sent me a little note over here, which was my fourth issue. It's right on target. What we really need more than anything right now is for you to be a great partner of ours, because business and Californians and citizens, your constituents, which are the same as ours, are looking to us to collectively say, just like coaching a soccer team, you can get your team to cooperate when you're 2 down, much better than when you are 2 up. I learned a lot from CalPERS reviewing the last 25 years of the good times and the last 2 years of being the bad times. You learn more in the last 2 years than you learned in the other 25. So we're down to, if we are great partners in this, we'll resolve this. We're bright enough to do that. I think those are the 4 steps we need.
Thank you. Any others? Yep.
Mr. Chairman,
and then Ms. Ryan.
For the special districts, I think fortunately we don't have to deal with the triple flip and no, thank you very much. We of course we like to keep our revenues that we currently have. I mean, the water district that I manage has the average income is way below the poverty level, and almost 20% of the water bill they pay represents the money taken by the state, and it's just not right in our view. The other is to remove, as we just touched upon here, is the impediments for us doing our job where we can, and then the unfunded mandates. If you can't fund them, relax them.
Thank you. Ms. Ryan, and then Mr. Miller, I think, has a question.
Yeah, I'd just like to, one statement about mandates. County mental health not only has, let's just say, Prop 1A hasn't been followed for the AB 3632 program, so the state didn't suspend the mandate, it didn't fully pay for the mandate, it just partially paid for the mandate. So we've got a problem there if we're at a point where we're going to pretty strongly advocate for either eliminating the mandate or just you've got to pay us for what you're mandating us to do, and that's going to be a big issue for us. So that's just a separate issue, but I wanted to get that out. I'm a student of good government. I believe in public service and I believe in good government, and I think that if, like everybody else has said, we are really in it. We are in a partnership, and we need to be doing the best job we can do at maximizing the effectiveness of the dollars we have, and we are not doing that right now. We are not working as partners, and that's why I mentioned earlier, I think that the state needs to do more oversight. What are we paying for? What are we using our dollars for? Is it effective? Do things need to change? What are the outcomes we're getting? Those are all things that some of the initiatives are trying to get at. But I think we sorely need to step back and look at what it is we want as a society. What are we paying for? Are we getting what we think we want, and are we getting what we need? And is there a better structure for how we accomplish that? And I know my members would welcome the opportunity to participate in a discussion just in our little area, not little, but large area of public service, I think that we're screaming out for more oversight on the part of the state.
I think the last comment come from Mr. Kennedy.
On behalf of the California Redevelopment Association, I would like to build on Supervisor Oliveira's comments. Leave us alone on the revenue side, but partner with us on the program side. Partnering with the private sector, partnering with the state, and partnering with local government is the way to grow the pie for everybody. And as Mr. Berryhill said, it's not a short-term fix, but in the long term, that's how we can get ourselves out of this fix.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Very good. Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. Chair, I just would like to say I would like to associate my remarks with the previous speakers.
Very fair.
Myself with the remarks of the previous speakers.
Very fair. All right, so committee members, thank you very much, panelists. We're now going to turn to members of the public who wish to be heard. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak on this segment of our hearing this afternoon?
They just want to be left alone.
Yeah, I think that may be so. All right, I see none. So now we're going to turn to our final panel, and that will be led by co-chair Senator DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll ask our panelists to come forward. I see Ms. McPeak and Mr. Genest, and I see Senator Peace coming forward. This panel, the subject is the state budget perspective options to better align responsibility, authority, and resources in administrating services for Californians, ensuring greater government accountability for the delivery of services, and creating a better fiscal relationship between state and local governments. And in the future, we'll have a category for a shorter sentence. So welcome. You've heard a lot of the discussion, and I think as both Mr. Fuhrer and I have said, it may be naive of us, but since you have been participants in many of these efforts, to actually come back with something that's meaningful for our colleagues in the legislature and hopefully for the administration. So, Mike, you're up first. We're going to take you in the order that you're on the agenda, then Senator Peace, and then Secretary McPeak, and then Marianne O'Malley's here to answer questions.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I will attempt to sing my swan song here as best I can. I actually don't have a lot of very creative thoughts on the subject because right now, as you know, whenever you think about the state or the states and the local governments and our relationship to each other, you kind of get stuck with our budget crisis that we're currently involved in. And it is a massive crisis. We thought we had it somewhat under control last year, at least for a year, and it's slipped away since then, as you know. I don't have any news to make on budget numbers, by the way, just for the record. Although I don't think the administration disagrees fundamentally with the legislative analyst's assessment and what you've been talking about today. I think we all know we have yet another really difficult budget in front of us. And when I think about that, it always comes back to me to a realization that for many years now, the state of California and its local governments have taken on more responsibility than we have resources for. In other words, we have defined more problems as a state problem, generally, than we have the money or the wherewithal to solve. And I think the solution to the state's budget problem ultimately has to come down to backing away from some of those obligations and responsibilities. Of course, it's easy to say that in the abstract, and once you get into the specific issues, it's much more difficult. I think probably the good news about that for local government is there's not a lot left in the state budget that is in the context of a relationship between us and the local governments fiscally. There are some things, depending on how broadly you define that. Some would say that Proposition 42 is a state-local arrangement. Others would say, no, it's just a local revenue stream in the Constitution. So there are some things at the margin, but for the most part, our finances, especially on the general fund side, are becoming less and less interrelated with local governments. And the one place where there's still a pretty substantial intersection is social services, to some degree health. At least they have a lot of responsibility for health. So as I said, I can't really think very creatively about how we would formulate a better relationship because we're in such a deep hole at the moment, and we have to fundamentally restructure, in my opinion, what state government does. Or there's always the other side of that equation. We could generate more resources. And that doesn't have to be through tax increases, of course. It could be through a better economy, but I don't think very many economists are predicting the kind of recovery that's going to get us out of the situation, fundamentally the type of situation that I just described. So as we are thinking about which responsibilities to back away from, I think that is a time, it's a difficult time, but it is a time to sort out which are better done at the local level and which at the state level. This administration, you may have noticed, has not proposed really any significant, quote, realignment in our entire term. And I can tell you from day one, in my involvement in the administration, we looked at realignment always as something, because there is a past to realignment. We have a history with it. We did it in the 90s. You could say we did it with trial court funding. However, it comes down to, at least in my judgment, as we've looked at this year after year, realignment comes down to two things. Either it can be a way of doing a tax increase, as it was in the 1990s, in the early 90s, where we did a tax increase, gave the revenue to local governments, and got a state advantage by reducing the state's share of some program costs. It can be looked at that way, or there is another way, much harsher way to look at it. You could say realignment would simply be for the state to say, no longer our problem, and take the money out, take the mandates out, and walk away entirely, and just let the local governments figure out whether to keep providing the service, or if so, how to provide it. Neither one of those two alternatives, the tax increase approach or the program termination approach, has ever found much traction in this administration, and so far I don't think it would find too much traction in this legislature. But we are probably on the verge of having to really think fundamentally about which programs we can even continue to provide. And as I said, that's probably not very creative, but that's what I have to offer at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Jess. Thanks for your years of service. It does seem that you seem much more relaxed now. Doesn't seem fair. Yeah. Okay.
But he'll get there.
Mr. Hill was blaming you for all the problems.
I heard
I think there's some merit to those accusations.
It's your turn, Senator Peace. Any pearls of wisdom would be appreciated.
Well, let me start by bringing you back to the LAO's presentation and bring you to number 6. And it's at once reassuring and dismaying to see that none of the players have changed, nor have any of the arguments in the last 15 or 20 years. But when you hear folks in local government saying, I just want to be left alone, understand that they want to start after this page, not before this page. And I call your attention to item 1, number 6, 1979, AB 8, State Proposition 13, bailout. And the state has been continuing to bail out local government, and that isn't meant to be a pejorative statement vis-a-vis local government, because local governments was where the consequence of the Prop 13 reduction in taxes were. And at the time, the state had a very large surplus for those days, and the political momentum led to the legislature to make the decision. And this was before even I was there, so we can all get together and blame everybody, since nobody in the room was there. Although some of the folks in the room, I think, probably were representing local government back then. The state got together. The state, ultimately, with pressure from local government, pressure from police, pressure from firefighters, pressure from labor unions, decided to pass AB 8. I would argue the problem isn't Prop 13. The problem is AB 8. Now let's go to the next pages. You can look at this later. You don't have to go, but if you thumb through the balance of the pages, you'll see that the history thereafter is not a fight between the state and local government. There's not a single instance in realignment or changing of these areas, or even the triple flip, which was my terminology, which ultimately became only a double flip because they only did 2/3 of the triple flip. Interestingly enough, the third they chose not to do was the third that involved bringing more revenue in, which makes a distinct difference. The fight has never been between the state and local government. The fight's between education and local government. Some of you will recall, I know Ms. Peak recalls, she participates, and I went around the state at one point, how many, it was a decade ago? More than that, 15, how old are we? And, tried to interest folks in local government and the education establishment to get together and get a permanent resolution with respect to aligning revenues with so we were in an environment where the people who had the responsibility and the obligation to spend the money were also the people who had the obligation and the responsibility to collect the money. The fundamental irrationality of the current system is we have one group of people who have to raise the money and a different group of people who have to spend it. And that will never work. It categorically will never work. And until the education establishment and the local government establishment put down their weapons and decide to come together with something that they will collectively support, this will go on and on and on. I'm extraordinarily disappointed to hear Chris say that local government, once again, is going to engage in another self-inflicted wound by moving still another initiative. In Prop 1A, they moved an initiative, and then when the governor proposed to use the letter of the law that they wrote, they objected to it. And government by formula is a mistake, and what we really have to do is simply align both. Let's leave folks alone, but let's give them both the reliability and the responsibility. They have to have the authority to deal with their own tax obligation, and that will, in large part, be where we ultimately end up. Finally, this is a broader picture. You all are confronted with an extraordinary problem, and it is of dimensions far beyond those which any of us confronted in the past. And nobody should diminish the significance of them, and nor should any of us be too sure we know what the answers are. But I think it also is important to understand that you don't have a problem. Your budget problem consists of three distinct parts. One is a historical structural issue that kind of was a creeping crud kind of thing. It happened over a period of many years. Mike just made reference to the starting to take on more and more obligations. In particular, during the boom times, Silicon Valley times, the first era of term-limited legislatures began to take what we understood were one-time monies in the form of capital gain bumps and started committing them to expansion of programs. Largely, the Healthy Children's Program was the major program expansion that occurred at that period of time. And so there are structural issues that are involved with that. But the second piece of the problem, candidly, in my view, happened in the early months of the current administration. The giving up the vehicle license fee with an executive order that later had to be cleaned up by a statute because it was clearly an illegal executive order, and not providing a revenue support for that. More importantly, the second executive action was to, and most people don't even know this, it was to cancel $1.7 billion worth of layoffs that had already been, I spent 10 months of my life going around the state meeting with, because you have to notice 100 employees for every one you ultimately lay off. It's a very arduous process. It's designed to fail. It was done. It was over. And those layoffs were supposed to have occurred about a week before Christmas. I don't begrudge the governor for not wanting to do that, but that $1.7 billion with layoffs, which would have happened in good economic times when people could have found jobs in the private sector and in other public sector jobs. It was exactly the time when we should have been doing that. That would have translated into probably $3.5 billion worth of annual savings in this budget. You could use that right now. You put those together, and then you add the additional borrowing that was layered on top of that in order to backfill the lack of revenue, and you deal with the costs associated with the borrowing. There are also some cash management issues, early retirement of much of the long-term debt that had been incurred in that period of time, which was debt that was sometimes at less than 1% interest rate and could still be paying on instead of be dealing in a much more expensive market. So I'd argue there were some cash issues, decisions incidentally not necessarily made in the governor's office. And then finally you have the third part of this, and this is the most troubling. And I think you have to be really careful not to underestimate the reality of this. And that is whatever we're living through, depression, recession, anomaly, whatever. Part of why things got out of control in that period of time is that as a society, it wasn't just state government, it was we Americans as a society, we were living a false economy. And we were living in this highly leveraged environment. And California, as is always the case, was at the forefront of that. And that leveraged private sector economy created a dramatic amount of wealth. And in California, on the government side, we got disproportionately dependent on it because of a tax structure that relies largely on the wealthy. We created a disproportionate share of very wealthy people whose wealth was rooted principally in the very aggressive use of debt. Things will get better, but we will never in our lifetime, I would suggest, and probably not in my son's lifetime, we will never revisit, I hope we don't, candidly, that kind of heated, debt-related, aggressive economic environment. Now, to understand what that means to you all, realize it's not a matter of waiting this out and waiting for things to get better. Because even when things get better, our current tax structure will not produce the kinds of revenue proportionately that they did in the old economy, because that disproportion, that very volatile revenue that the LAO makes reference to and others have makes reference to, is it's the consequence of research based upon a private economic model and an experience in the private sector that produces a tax revenue as a consequence of the nature of the private economy. What you all ought to be most focused on right now is one thing: the NUMMI plant. Nothing else. You should be holding hearings on nothing but how to save that plant. I live in San Diego. Why do I care about the NUMMI plant? There's 50,000 jobs directly and indirectly at stake on that plant closing. Under no circumstances should this legislature or this government let that plant close. And yet it's destined to close right now. I don't care what you have to do to keep people employed there. If you've got to 100% subsidize it in the short term to buy time, you have to do it. Because the spiral effect of losing that plant, not just in the microeconomic sense of that immediate area around the NUMMI plant and in the Bay Area, but the cumulative effect of what the signal that sends to what's California about in terms of committing its future is dramatic. Because contrary to Chris's assertion about there being indifferent to retail jobs versus other kinds of jobs, he's dead wrong. Part of why we're in trouble is we bought into the idea, a Walmart job is just as good as an auto worker job, and that's nonsense. Because if you don't make things at the core of your economy, if you're not producing goods, if you don't have a healthy and vibrant a manufacturing sector, you won't have any retail sector. There's got to be somebody making things, so ultimately they have excess capital to buy things. Retail is not a core business. It's the little fish that travel along with the whales, and we're letting all the whales go away. I would urge you, and I'm sorry that Mr. Berryhill isn't here because he's absolutely right, that all this will be irrelevant if we don't put people back to work. But I don't think it's just about putting back to work generically, and I would argue vigorously with Chris. It's also about the kind of jobs we put them back to work on. And when you look at the education environment, the change in the folks that are coming out of into the work world now, and what kind of education they have, and you look at dropout levels, and we look at a variety of things, if you think we're going to employ them all pushing buttons on computers in Silicon Valley jobs, you're kidding yourself. And that's what our biggest problem is. And we have the danger here of having things be far worse than they are now, even as the national economy improves. Because underneath all of this, the real creep and crud is the absolute evisceration of the manufacturing sector in this state. And that's where your attention ought to be focused. I actually support and do believe the things we tried to do a decade ago in terms of realigning revenue structures are important, and you should pursue them. But your goal ought to be this. What can we do to incent local government to want manufacturing jobs and to create the environment where they'll encourage manufacturing to come into their communities? Because that's the lifeblood of any economic system in any place, anywhere in this world or any other.
Thank you, Senator. Sunny, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. First, it's much nicer to be sitting at the same table with Mr. Genest and Mr. Peace than on the other side. It's an honor to come back and share some thoughts with you. As Marianne O'Malley talked about the concept of wiping clean a hard drive, I couldn't help but think about what Kevin Starr has said. So, noted California historian and our state librarian emeritus says we need to reboot California. Since I work in the world of a digital economy these days, I think that's particularly apropos, but it means totally restart. And I do think that, at least as I reflect on where did I come into this California movie in about 1972, that is when I was first really in the workplace trying to manage community human services, health and human services in Contra Costa County. I thought the state was dysfunctional then because there was no transparency with respect to outcomes and accountability. And I think there is a real message to be taken from Mr. Peace's observations. I guess my take on it is that actually the wheels began to come off, or what we've been going through for 4 decades in California is a slow awakening to what it means to be competitive in a global economy. There has been a huge continuing tectonic shift in the marketplace and what it means to actually be competitive. Our governance structures and our government institutions are totally anachronistic to what it will take to actually help grow the economy. Now, what that means, because let me be clear, government doesn't really create jobs. We always talk about it. The private sector is where jobs get generated. Private capital gets invested, gets attracted to a community, into a state, and it's from there that jobs get generated. The government creates an environment of sorts in which capital is either more likely to be invested or less likely to be invested. And for 4 decades, we've been on that slope of less likely vis-a-vis where we were. California still has many, many, many strengths. Let me hasten to say that. Our government structures are not one of them. And we are in danger of not remaining on that cutting edge as a state. So let me comment a little further. So if we have to reboot California, I actually think it's important to take a step back and even ask, why do we have government at all? Now, I'm here because I'm like the old lady in the room, but I'm also representing California Forward. And California Forward as a governance government reform entity actually has one of the major tenets of moving government closer to people. That's a very deeply seated, heartfelt commitment of California Forward. I'm embarrassed to say that as Marianne went through her list of 10, and I've got my list of 10 things you could do to improve things, I was there when Prop 13 passed. That's the year I was elected. I negotiated AB 8. I mean, literally sat there on behalf of counties, sat there in 91 to negotiate program realignment with a joint committee from the Senate and the Assembly. Supervisors actually sat with the committee members. And then the next year, because we didn't have, Mr. Fiore, there are lessons out of program realignment. The first is you must have explicit accountability, outcomes and accountability. The second is you better dedicate and guarantee constitutionally the revenues to support those programs. And the third is you have to continue to come back and revisit the relationship and publish results. So there is a need for a different relationship between the state and local governments, but it's more fundamental. I call it a new partnership with the people. And by that I mean we need to, if we ask ourselves, why do we have government? I actually start with governance, which is the way in which we pursue our shared goals and collective aspirations. Government is just the legal official structure we put in place to try to do that. And we should want the least government possible in order to achieve those goals, because we support government with taxes. We have to be able to empower people. And when I say that, I do mean down to the citizen themselves, in their family, in their neighborhood, and what they do in their community organizations and public-private partnerships. By extension, it also means we have to have healthy, stable local governments and allow those local governments at the local level within a county to do what you referenced, Mr. Chairman, the community charter concept that came out of the Constitutional Revision Commission was the idea that one could have all of the cities and special districts, including education, within a county decide the tax allocation within the 1%, within what Prop 13 allows, so that it wasn't necessarily having to be done here in Sacramento to do that allocation. Let me just wind this up in terms of that new partnership with people. I think it's very important in order to try to attract capital investment, to jumpstart this economy, that we don't just do a back away from the table at the state and dump everything at the local level. There's got to be a very agile partnership, a continuing, deep, abiding relationship between the state and locals in collectives to regions, but that has to be ongoing. You don't just pass program realignment, and then there's no a follow-up from either the administration or the legislature. The job should be of our elected officials, you who represent us, to have success occur in our programs. And that means being our real partners, being down there, if you will, in the community and at the regional level. Senator Wolk knows very well, I'm going to come back to this whole mantra of starting with the transparency of being clear, what is it we're trying to achieve? Working with the principle that once we establish that, you push down to the level closest to the people where something can get implemented that is efficient and effective and at the right scale. And there are many things that are best done at a neighborhood level that you would push down from a county or a city. There are some things that you cannot fully do at a countywide level. We know them. Transportation happens to travel back and forth across political boundaries. Air districts, air basins usually aren't confined to a given political jurisdiction, nor are labor markets, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to be able to get to the right scale and empower that. We don't have that in California today. There is not a clear idea why we have government. We have very few outcomes. The one I've cited this before that I'm aware of, I was accountable for, which is no more than a 30-minute wait line at the DMV. Well, we got it 21 minutes. And that was, the whole effort of driving to an outcome and then continuously working with, I might say, 7,800 public employees, state employees who very much wanted to do a good job, needed the support, the leadership, the reinforcement to do so, but they turned around DMV. And we have to be able to use the tools of we call it results-based government now at California Forward, or performance-based budgeting, but it's more than budgeting. It's real management, real leadership, and report to the public. So ultimately the taxpayers and the citizens are our first line of watchdog on what we're doing with their dollars. I could say a lot more. I'll answer questions.
Thanks, Sunny. All right, comments or questions from committee members? By the way, it wasn't Mr. Hill. I chimed in and blamed you specifically, Senator, but it was purely facetious.
Likewise.
Questions or comments? Senator Weiland.
I'd just like to make a comment on what Senator Peace had to say about retention of business and business investment. Senator DeSaulnier and I heard or were subjected to Senator Wright's extensive comments, very passionate on this issue. I don't think, of all the things that I've heard discussed and some earlier in my office, I don't think there's anything that is any more important, maybe some as much, but any more, because you can shift all sorts of things around, but at the end of the day, the money is the money is the money. In order to generate the revenue that we're talking about moving in different places, we're competing. And my understanding is that when NUMMI made its decision, and I don't know if I thought its decision was final, maybe it isn't.
Well, its decision is final, but you have a facility there, and the opportunity is to identify somebody who can put people to work doing something in that facility.
Well, I think along those same lines, to get someone to invest, you have to deal with things like energy costs. It costs too much. And respecting the concerns of other members of the legislature, for example, in increasing the amount of our energy that comes from renewable resources, it happens to drive up costs. We heard Assemblyman Hill convened and has convened several hearings with the biotech community. In San Diego the other day, we heard of having to compete with states which charge no sales tax for manufacturing equipment. Something like 48 states don't charge that equipment. And we could go on and on there. I think we have to look at competing with other states, and we just have to be competitive, and I think it's very difficult. In Texas, where they've made a big effort to do this, and I believe in this recession they have not lost jobs. They have made an enormous effort. It's been, in terms of the government part, it's been bipartisan, and my understanding is just in permits involved. And when I talk to people about that, it's one of the things they will cite. So if you have an Intel, to use a very well-known company, that made a decision recently to invest $6 or $7 billion in Arizona, New Mexico, and I think Oregon, and you talk to their executives, and they will say, we will never build another plant in California. We do have to turn that around somehow, and it may mean even temporary suspension of certain things that many members hold dearly. It may be other tax incentives, and I know many members feel that those are tax expenditures. But the reality is, no matter how much we may hope for something different, we're competing with them. And the only other thing that we can't control as easily is the globalization part. But we could make a big effort to try to do something about that nationally. When we read about what's going on in Copenhagen, it kills me that 25% of the particulate emissions in our air, and I know we have a lot of members who care about that, and I certainly do too, come from China building a coal plant, a dirty coal plant, every couple of weeks. And we sit there and let them lecture us about, you know, how we have to cut emissions. I mean, that's on the national level. I think we ought to try to do something about that as well, because, and that combined with the demographic challenges and the dropout rate, I think, is a recipe for real problems unless we figure out how to fix it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wolk and then Senator Leno.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Sonny a question. With respect to California Forward and realignment or devolution of responsibilities to the local level, are there sectors that or areas that you think are more amenable to realignment than others? And in particular, I want to ask you about education.
Okay. So California Forward has done a fair amount of work, but knows a lot more needs to be done. One of the initiatives that has been filed is to essentially allow the community charter notion where at least a county, a city, and a school district had to partner around an action plan, and that there would be benefits associated with that. What California Forward has looked at, although it's not yet now filed in the initiative form, when we've discussed the budgeting issue, is to recognize at the general fund, state general fund level, there is an inextricable relationship between the state general fund and what goes on at the local level, particularly counties and school districts, but also cities have a piece of it. So let me try to explain this. There are the three big buckets, as I call them, at the state general fund. You've got education, although there's a real difference between K-12 and higher education. There's all these programs in health and welfare that largely are implemented at the local level. Of course, K-12 is also implemented locally. And then we've got corrections. We have failures in those first two buckets, and that's why we got problems in corrections. And that's the shame of California, is that we have all of these people in prisons and paying more than any other state. But in order to be able to have you at the state level get better results from those three buckets and a better deal for taxpayers, because I would submit to you the taxpayers are still not getting a very good deal in California, and at the same time we're not investing enough in the right things, education and infrastructure. So we got this dilemma. In order to be able to make sense out of the state general fund, it means, can we say what we're going to do about education and beyond just the testing? Do we know the hows? And we know a lot more about the hows, what you actually do to get to improved education, to close the achievement gap. Those, similarly, in health and welfare, we do the same. I think, as you heard in the previous panel, if we could set those goals, those outcomes collectively, that it's a sort of a dynamic process, a dynamic partnership where you, the state, holds hearings. You get the input from the professionals like our educators and mental health workers and the public health officers, et cetera, and local elected officials. Okay, what are the 5 things we think are the outcomes and how are we going to measure those? Then you can devolve the responsibility and accountability to a lower level for operating programs. You want to push that down. But you've also, in my experience, working now, first before I was elected, I got forced to run for office because I thought it was so screwed up. I was just trying to make people well in, community health clinics. We actually probably can't turn around the poorest neighborhoods where you've got the poorest schools unless there's integrated delivery of human services, and there's nothing that prohibits a county, and several have started to do that kind of really integrated service delivery in school attendance areas. However, the state could really incent that and foster it by putting money on the table and also by facilitating the lessons learned. Do it obviously in partnership with CSAC and the league, and it's those kinds of things, Senator Wolk, that California Forward has looked at. I think we're really focusing on those big chunks and what that means to have set outcomes and encourage more and allow more flexibility locally to integrate those services.
As one other follow-up, as part of California Forward's discussion, has there been any discussion about revisiting the AB8 allocation, which I agree with Mr. Peace is essential?
Yeah, right. And I was there to, as I said, to negotiate it. There has, and I must confess, I keep asking, where the hell are we vis-a-vis AB8 as we stand now?
Within the confines.
Within the confines of AB8. Yes. The answer would be yes, there is. I understood your question to be, is there any interest in revisiting AB8? Mm-hmm. That is the allocation of the 1% among all the taxing authorities at the local level. My response is yes, there is, and the way that we have thought it made the most sense, the wisest way to approach that is to really encourage the community action plan and the community charter. Okay. I have sat through literally every exercise in the last 20 years in California to do all of the computer runs on what do you do with 480 cities, 58 counties, 3,000 special districts, and is there a formula that makes sense? The answer is not really, although you can make some sense. In program realignment, it was 16 programs that got transferred. I'm the one who not only sat with you, but in 3 meetings of the Big Five with Governor Wilson and Speaker Brown and President Pro Tempore Roberti, they looked to me to say, are you sure San Francisco and Los Angeles isn't getting screwed? And the answer was yes. We actually were able to ensure that nobody lost money. There was.
At least not San Francisco, it's Los Angeles.
Yeah, right. Well, they were the two big ones, and
sorry.
and I will say, and there was Ross Johnson, who didn't want Orange County disadvantaged, and there was also Ken Maddy, who and I had to make sure the San Joaquin Valley was okay. And the way we made it happen is that all 58 counties got at least a bare minimum, and we had ways to do catch up. So you can, in a growing economy, be able to accommodate it. But when you look at what historically existed in 1978, there is no commonality among counties. And in fact, you had 2 things going on, either inefficiencies in local government, therefore they had higher taxes, higher tax rates that already had been locked in, or some would say some had courage and they had actually increased the tax rate, so they're making more investments. It's very hard to sort that out, so you have to have another way of approaching it. The community charter would actually be a pretty good way, because you start with, locally you have to agree on the outcomes, and I suggest the state would want to be a partner in that. You can sit there. You represent your own area. You could sit there in those meetings. Then let the locals figure out what makes sense. There is a constitutional provision that really is important, in my opinion, and I think California Forward would say this. I know you asked that question to Ms. O'Malley, but let me offer you my answer. and that is the way that we define government is actually in our Constitution. And the way that we drive a cultural change, how do we behave, is do we say it is the policy of the state of California that we're going to have the most efficient government possible, we're going to have the level of government that can do it in the most efficient and effective way, and every government agency shall publish on a regular basis after holding public hearings outcomes and metrics, and they shall report to the public on a regular basis. You start putting that into the Constitution, now you have a different set of dynamics.
Senator Leno.
If I may, I've got one question for Sonny with regard to California Forward and also the now circulating ballot initiative for the proposed Constitutional Convention, which, as I understand it, does not have any allowance for debate or discussion at the convention regarding how we tax and how much we tax, that will not be on the table. So there will be no discussion, much less revisiting, of Proposition 13, or for that matter, AB 8. And my question is, from a California Forward perspective, given that so much of what we've discussed in these hearings and so much of the discussion around our dysfunction is exactly that. And I don't want to say of what value would the convention be, but how diminished will the value of the convention be without the allowance of that conversation. And then after I get your brilliant response, I would like to tap into the brain trust that we have here with regard to some of the issues that Mark had brought up earlier.
Well, I have no brilliance to share with respect to, I think, your question. I will just observe that I personally appreciate the heartfelt efforts of the backers of the Constitutional Convention movement, and I know that they've struggled with trying to strike the balance of how to engage the people of California and not open up everything to a free-for-all and then get it passed. And so you know all of those kind of things that go into the calculus of a ballot measure. So I know they made the decision just to limit the scope. Having said that, I don't know what language they're finally ending up with. I think things getting refiled. So what I hear, though, and I think all of us might reflect on this a moment. Every Californian probably learned in 4th and 8th grade that the basic document in a government is a constitution. And so we at least remember that. And I think the support for a constitutional convention in the public, the body politic, is that they're so ticked off at what they think is everything going wrong. And so that's why the public says, well, we must have to redo the Constitution because everything's so wrong. There's limited things that have to be put in the Constitution, a lot more that can be done with us just around this table.
If I may?
Sure, of course.
I don't think there's anything more troubling to me as a person who, figures there's no better than a 50-50 chance that my 10-week-old grandson will live in a democracy. I don't think there's anything that concerns me more than the well-intended but extremely poor idea of constitutional convention. Look, this is about the legislature just bucking it up and doing its job. This is tough. I wouldn't change seats with you. And believe me, the size of your budget problem this year are going to far outrun the dialogue either at California Forward or at the country. You don't have the time to wait for these complicated ideas to be debated back and forth. And you got the same special interest group sitting at California Forward that you have sitting in the legislature. And I respect the effort, and I don't mean to demean it in any way, but at the end of the day, they're seeking consensus. And you don't have time for consensus. You need to seek solutions. And as you face this budget problem, issues such as, are we going to go ahead and get rid of a lot of mandates? Well, most of those mandates came about because someplace in the state somebody was doing something that somebody observed to be very good and they weren't doing it in another another locality, and the folks in that locality wanted it, so they ran to the state and said, gee, over here in San Francisco they're doing this, and I live in Sacramento and I don't get this, and I want my assemblyman to go make sure that Sacramento has to do this too. You're going to have to decide what you're willing to give up, and I think you are going to have to give up a whole bunch, maybe all of it. Second thing I think you're going to have to do is confront, and it's easier for me as a Democrat to say than it is for Mike to say this, so let me say it. You're going to have to look at your own bureaucracy, and you're going to have to recognize that we probably don't really need a Department of Health Services and a Department of Developmental Services and Department of Mental Health, and that we're way over department, and that we that the effort that we had started in my brief change as Director of Finance, and I think I learned a lot getting out of the legislature and going over there. And one of the things I learned was we not only can consolidate and do things more efficiently, but we've put our employees in a very unfair place. We have a lot of people who are basically, government has become a computer. Most jobs involve operating computers. And we've been operating under a hiring freeze in the state for over 15 years, really, on and off for almost 20. And take a look at the average age of state employees. We don't have a lot of young employees. And, well, when you talk about operating computers, who do you think is good at it, and who do you think? Bulletin, we and the rest of the baby boomers aren't all that good. You can train us till the cows come home. But you can take the average 22-year-old off the street. He's going to outgun me no matter how much you train me. We need to reinvigorate our workforce and get new young people into that workforce. And there are things that we can do that are also fiscally prudent in terms of giving positive incentives for some of our employees with our near retirement. It also can help deal with some of our retirement issues. But you're going to have to be very aggressive about getting the state shop in order for local government, school districts, and others to take credibly the reality that they're going to get hit again. But what I would urge you to do is to recognize that what they say is they want to be leave us alone. Leaving alone is a two-edged sword, and they have to take both sides of the sword. They can't say leave us alone but keep sending us the money. You need to, I think leaving alone is where, and I think that's where California Forward is trying to get more of the local government down to the local level where it's closer to the public and closer to the people, and folks tend to be more accountable, and I think that's where we ought to go. The hard thing from a policymaker's perspective, and all of us care about all the reasons we ran for office and why you're all here, the hard thing is you got to let go of control along with it. And it's not responsible to let go of control and still fund it. It leaves local government in the position of being a permanent kid in college who, when they run out of money, say, send more. There's a reason why when you compare a job description by job description, that state employees, a state engineer is paid significantly less than a local government engineer. A state, you can go all across the board. It's 20 to 30% lower. It's a reason why the state pension.
Same with legislators.
Is exactly true.
Well, now.
Well, now there's a reason why when you look at the pensions, the local government pensions are generally much more generous than state employee pensions, because there was an era in local government where local government officials for 30 years really didn't have, post-Prop 13, didn't have to deal with confronting, am I going to raise taxes or am I not going to raise taxes? And the political pressure was, to make sure I can hire cops in competition with the local government down the street, and that had its rumbling effect. If you all haven't read the UCLA recent study, you should. I mean, my experience is that of all the folks out, generally UCLA has been the closest to getting it. It's hard for consensus forecasters to be right because they, by definition, have to use consensus. But one of the things in the UCLA report this year that they warn against, they say they see evidence of some private sector recovery beginning in this 2010-2011, but it's going to be dragged down by public sector.
Yeah.
That's a troubling thing, and it brings me back to the point I made at the front end. The only way, and Mark, I think there are ways to be competitive, both on the tax structure, energy costs, water costs. There are ways to go in, but you have to recognize up front you're going to subsidize. You just got to go in. I mean, and last thing I want to do is talk about energy, but I'll go back. I'll go back to a question I asked the manufacturers when they came and they said they wanted this competitive thing. I said, well, if you want lower costs for manufacturing, so why don't we can build that into the regulated rate structure? Why don't you just let us subsidize that rate? They didn't want that. They insisted on, they wanted this market nutso thing. But you still can go back, and we can go back, and you can. It's in our interest as residential ratepayers to say, I'll pay a little more in my residential rate so that I can subsidize able to make sure my kid can have a job. And that's what you do when you subsidize the energy rate for job-creating entities. And the same thing's true of water. We do it in agriculture. There's no reason why we can't do it in the biotech industry. We got to disabuse ourselves. Let me put it in partisan terms. As Democrats, we ought to disabuse ourselves of the relatively recent notion that we've embraced that when we protect the ratepayer population at the retail level in the residential area at the expense of the private sector area, that we're doing a favor for our constituents. Historically, Democrats were more about subsidizing jobs. And even I'm old enough to have lived in the era when we were busy trying to reduce the cost of doing business to provide jobs. And we've just kind of, we drifted. When I first got to the legislature, the debate between Republicans and Democrats was about who had a better idea for growing the economy. And over time, long before you guys got here, it drifted to a debate about how are we going to divide up the static pie. And if we don't get back to challenging ourselves to get back into the debate about growing the economy, none of this is going to matter.
Well, that's a good segue then to my second aforementioned question, which is, given the severity of the budget shortfall, and I love Mike's comment on this as well, and the competing interests and tensions that we've got, if we were to collectively decide we've got to do everything we can proactively through tax incentive, tax breaks, which are tax expenditures, costs to the general fund, to bring manufacturers back. And we know we need to have an educated populace for us to have a competitive economy.
How do you get here from there?
How do we get here from there? What's our next step? And we're going to be simultaneously attempting to protect what little we have left of our social safety net all at the same time.
I think the answer to that question, and I failed miserably at it. So maybe you collectively can be a lot more successful than I was. The answer is to get those well-paid representatives from the local government groups, the education groups, and manufacturing group stuff to go back and lobby in reverse and start telling their principals, stop fighting amongst each other. Stop proposing initiatives. The worst thing the League of Cities could do for the League of Cities is to propose an initiative. It's dumb. But I understand the mentality and what drives it. Everybody wants to go to war. This is the worst time for Californians to go to war with each other. And, at the risk of sounding like Rodney King, can't we all get along? Use your collective, persuasion to encourage them to come together and have something they're all willing to support. When the education community and the local government community walk into your office and say we're both on the same side and we're not going to fight, and the business community will support the same thing, then and I don't know what their answer will be, but that's when you're going to be turning the corner.
Go ahead, then.
Yeah, really, we've been waiting your response.
Well, I spent a lot of time with the Governor's Tax Commission, the Commission on the 21st Century Economy, and one of the things that was frustrating is as you look at the literature on business location, it is intuitive. And I personally believe that taxes make a difference to business location. But as you look at the rigorous economic literature, there's just no evidence in that literature. Now, we all know, and especially I tend to deal a lot with a lot of elected Republicans, of course, and I hear a lot of stories from them about business people coming to them and saying these taxes are why I'm leaving, and we can all cite, various famous people who've left the state because there's no tax in Florida or what have you. So I think there is merit to that argument. I think the Tax Commission had an interesting approach to it, and one that I hope the legislature continues to take a look at, which is fundamental economic theory on this thing is that you should have a broad tax base and a low marginal tax rate. We have the highest marginal tax rates in the country now. Some of those are permanent, but we're still going to be very high on the rest when the temporary ones come down. And there is a way on a revenue neutral basis to spread the burden more evenly and more across the entire economy and to reduce the marginal tax rates. I think marginal tax rates are what would make a difference. But I think what I've heard from, again, not in any rigorous way, but just from individual. It's what Mr. Weiland was saying. You hear about businesses talking about our energy costs and our other costs of doing business, the regulatory burden. I went to a speech by the president of a major oil company. I guess I'll give it away by saying he talked about his Richmond plant, and where he was going to expand the Richmond plant, create 3,000 jobs for several years in the Bay Area, and 3 years later, because of having passed various regulatory hurdles and then being sued by the city of Richmond, he gave it up. And the story he told was that there was another company in another country that had the same idea to build a plant, but they were going to build one from scratch at roughly the same time he did. And by the time they gave up their whole idea of expanding that plant, this other company was actually already running at full bore the new plant that they had built in China. So I think there is a lot of merit to this regulatory burden thing. I don't know exactly how you would deal with it. It's not my area of expertise. But I do think the tax side can be addressed even in a revenue neutral way. Of course, right now our revenue is substantially less than our obligations, so I'm not sure revenue neutral is really, in the long run, an option. I should say one other thing, because it somewhat presaged the budget, and you've probably heard the governor speaking of this. We've talked about the state government, we've talked about the local government, we haven't spoken about the federal government. That is another player in the equation. We do, in fact, send more money to the federal government than they send to us. Some of that is natural. We tend to be richer, therefore we pay more federal tax. We don't have as many defense plants as we used to, therefore we have fewer defense things. But I think there is a good case to be made that we are not getting our, quote, fair share of the federal pie. And then in one other way, the federal government plays a huge role with us, and that is that they offer us these programs, child welfare, relatively new program. My first job at the Legislative Analyst's Office was to analyze SB 14, which made child welfare a program in California. Before that, counties did what counties did, and there was really not much state involvement at all. Now it's a multi-million-dollar program. But the federal government puts money on the table. We step in and say, well, that's an important social need. We'll address that. And it seems reasonable, but over time, between living in the Ninth Circuit, which is a really huge part of our problem since we seem to lose every single court case, or damn near all of them, but between living in the Ninth Circuit and the rules that the federal government keeps accreting into these programs, what you set out to agree to, with a lot of flexibility on your part. When you started Medi-Cal, it could have cost this, it could have cost half of that, it could have cost double that. Pretty much your choice. Now, Medi-Cal is almost a unitary thing. There are some things you can do at the margin in Medi-Cal, but pretty much if you wanted to cut Medi-Cal by 20%, you would lose all your federal funding because you couldn't possibly do that within the rules that the federal government has laid out. So I think in addition to these other realignments, thinking about what we should do with these federal programs and what they should do with them. Should they give us more flexibility to adjust the spending to our needs? That's one option. Should they give us more money? Maybe some combination of those two things. But back to your original question, I think the budget situation is just too severe to contemplate any kind of major tax subsidy for an industry or any sort of major tax cut. I mean, I do think reducing the marginal rates and spreading the burden makes a lot of sense, as the tax commission has proposed. But our budget situation is going to drive a lot of decisions, and the budget has a way of making us do things that don't make sense, but within the context of the budget, that's all we can do. And I predict we're going to be doing that some more.
You know, there's the other side of the federal discussion. Californians have spent very little time putting any kind of attention on the disproportionate consequence of federal tax policy on California. Just as a result of the alternative minimum tax alone, Californians send $100 billion a year more to Washington. Now, what's your budget? So if you just repealed the alternative minimum tax, you could fund the entire state budget and eliminate state taxes. Now, that's why your constituents look at you and say, what do you mean you want to raise taxes? We're beat up because we have a tax structure built for Kansas. And we have a higher cost of living here, so there's basically 5 states in the union that pay 90% of the alternative minimum tax. And we're number 1 on the list. And it's the mathematical consequence of being a higher cost state. Our taxpayers lose and every year they claim they make adjustments in it and lower where it impacts. Well, they quietly make other adjustments, so you start losing, various kinds of deductions. You would argue all of these latest incentives. No Californians get them because almost every Californian is in an income bracket in which they're excluded from the various deductions. If it was 1776, Californians would be at the front of the line. I shouldn't use a Tea Party allusion. We ought to be holding our congressional members accountable for what has become an incredibly onerous tax structure on the federal level as it relates to California.
It's a good segue. Sonny, you once dressed up as Thomas Jefferson at a tea party.
I did. I had a tea party. It was 1992. It was protesting the first ERAF. So I dressed as Thomas Jefferson on the west, the West Side Capitals. Yeah, at the Capitol. And that is because the year before, when we did program realignment, I said if we do not get the VLF and the half-cent sales tax constitutionally guaranteed, we'll return to what we knew was the standard method of budgeting for the state vis-a-vis local government, which we call shift and shaft. And that is exactly what we always got. There would be a shift and a shaft to local government. And I said, I did not expect we'd get screwed literally the very next year when ERAF came along, but indeed that is what happened. So I would like to say back to you, Mark, the question of, so what do? We have to actually focus on how do we grow the economy, just not how do we cut here. Although we have to be able to balance our budget. And there are some things that we've done in the past with warrants so that you weren't just totally dismantling everything. But I would say that, dare say, there is very little of the way government is organized that we actually want to save. So you want to seize the crisis to do the major reforms. And the stuff I talked about today you can do next year in the budget bill, and you should. You literally should be looking at these kinds of major reforms vis-a-vis the relationship of the state and the federal government. But when I try to answer your question, and let me just confess, I slept through Econ 101, but then I spent 10 years working with the major employers in the Bay Area, and maybe I have a false sense of security or understanding of the economy. But there are fundamentals, there is focus, there is investment and reform that we've got to do. And the way that California competes globally is that we add value to products. We add generally brain power to things. We're adding the intelligent quotient. We're always going upstream. And that means the last thing you want to do is do away with an R&D tax credit. I mean, we used to have the premier research institutions in the world. That is no longer something we can take for granted. We will never be the place where it's the cheapest to do business in the world. We need to be the place where someone gets the highest return on investment, that they would want to be here because we have acceptable energy costs and a clean environment, making that shift to R&D in the green energy. But you better never really destabilize an economy without having adequate energy. Steve can tell you that. Nothing takes down an economy faster than not having energy to begin with, or water, I might add, and then high prices. So we want to look at how do we maintain that premier edge in research. So don't do away with the R&D tax credit. One of the ideas that is important, I think, for the biotech industry is still the net carryover and aligning the NOL with the federal government. But if you talk to let me just for a moment talk about life sciences, because one of the things I also look at is, so where do we have strengths today? You have to very systematically say, where does California, not picking winners and losers from government, but looking at where the private sector is invested. Where do we have comparative advantage vis-a-vis other states and other nations? And there are 10 or 12 industries that we want to hang on to. They range from ag to high tech to IT, this mega cluster, and we've got bioscience, life science. We do the R&D, manufacturing goes elsewhere. Now, what would be something that would keep the manufacturing? We do some of the piloting here, and it takes 10 years to go from R&D and through the trials to be able to do manufacturing. Well, if we actually had two things, one, a trained workforce, And that's a community college issue. Those technicians are literally 2-year degrees. They can be 2 and 2, high school and college, but getting the community colleges mobilized around that workforce would do a lot.
And the high schools.
And I said high schools, it's 2 and 2. So you've got the 2 years, when I say 2 and 2, I'm sorry for the code. It's the last 2 years of high school in sort of a work learn situation, the 2 years of community college. Now we've got a reason why the people who did R&D might do manufacturing. I will tell you, when I was secretary, I probably spent as much time in Baja California as any other member of the cabinet, because we've got a shared region there. And the state of the country of Mexico and the state of Baja California will put manufacturing, if not on our side, right on the other side of the border, where we could be offsetting the global manufacturing in Asia to actually hedge against some global event, weather event, that we could do manufacturing probably of our life sciences R&D products if we focused on it. So that's an example. Let me give you another one, because I am concerned about when you see a plant like NUMMI go down, the last thing you would do is lose jobs you already have. So sometimes you start doing the tourniquet approach, but if that means subsidizing something that isn't long-term a comparative advantage, it's probably not a good strategy. But what does California have when it comes to automobiles? We're probably the design center in the country. Not manufacturing. We've got one manufacturing plant. But in terms of automobile design and also on the edge of clean vehicles, that's California's niche that we want to keep. So what do? You go to the manufacturers and say, and the designers, how do we keep you here? You start with that question of, how do we keep you here? That means it's not just passing a law here, it's a really, really deeply engaged partnership, I guess is what I would call it, of the private sector, of what it means for you to want to do business in California. And you keep doing those workouts.
Mr. Fuhrer.
Thanks very much. It is so tempting, because this is such a high-powered panel. It's tempting to ask you for oracular wisdom on every facet of California life. It's very much appreciated. I want to talk about disconnecting and then later connecting things. There's been some discussion here about the degree to which reforms that we embark on will affect in a positive way the budget to come. I think we should disabuse ourselves of that notion in any facet of the hearings we've had before. This is not a process that we're engaged in that's going to suddenly magically balance a budget that's $20 billion out of whack. This is about what Mr. DeSaulnier referred to earlier. This is about not missing an opportunity to enact major structural changes that can help, if not completely fend off, loosen, soften the blow of what might happen in the future, and not miss the opportunity that we missed as a collective body 15 years ago or so. So having said that, disconnecting this conversation from immediate fixes to this year's budget, I want to talk about some connections for a minute and sort of in a meandering way offer a proposition that people might want to respond to a little bit. In prior hearings that the panelists here were not available for, we discussed extensively the notion of an outcome-based budget. I will say publicly I'm going to be a promoter of what would be a radical shift in how we do business. Mr. DeSaulnier has been a promoter of the same basic concept. And it would be a sea change for us to collectively decide what matters most and then organize ourselves around effectuating those priorities. It would require us to not think in the compartments we think now. If we want to talk about, an educated workforce and narrow the focus to that of manufacturing, for example, it requires us to look beyond the mere interconnection between community college and K through 12, but all kinds of other societal issues that relate to how those kids get educated. But other states have begun to move in this direction, and they're making some headway. If we move in the direction of an outcomes-based budgeting approach, and the earlier panelists, many of them suggested invigorating oversight, which is a concomitant of that approach. We have to do that. Now I want to connect all that to the discussion that brings us here today, and that's the relationship between state and local service delivery and the devolution of authority. Ms. McPeak mentioned the notion that if you go to an outcomes-based approach, maybe that would enable you more effectively to devolve some authority, if that's considered a goal in itself. And I want to explore that a little bit. Assume for the moment something that this committee may decide not to ratify, but assume for the moment that we move to an outcomes-based approach that's predicated on knowing what people want in a sophisticated way, and then organizing ourselves around doing that. And then we say, you know what, given these goals, many of the services that are delivered to effectuate these goals are accomplished at the local level. Now, with that in mind, connect some dots for us in a specific way, if you could, because precision is really helpful in this discussion. 10,000 feet, not so much. How would you conceive of this committee starting from that outcomes-based approach, saying there's some intrinsic value in local control and local service delivery, tie these concepts together? What kinds of steps would you recommend we take if this is an approach that makes some sense, that we could start to effectuate this year and move forward with? Is it an intelligible question?
Yeah, I think I think there's a problem implicit in the question.
Okay.
I don't think you can simultaneously say you're going to give control up to local government and then say, and we're still going to determine what the outcomes are we want. I think once you give it up, you got to give it up, and it's their decision about what metrics they're going to adopt to identify success or failure, and that's kind of the threshold. I think that you either go that way, and if you try to split the baby and try and give it to them, and at the same time maintain some, quality control, so to speak, and be the. I think you just end up in the worst of all worlds. That's kind of where we are now. In all truth, you're just changing the emphasis as opposed to making that fundamental shift. If you do not, you've either got to embrace having the state take all this stuff, take responsibility for it, be totally in control of it. If there's shortfalls, you pay for it all, and you command and control from the state level. Or you got to give it down to the local level and give command and control to the local level. I think to try and do it in between in any way is a mistake.
Can I just engage a little bit on this? I actually wanted to listen much more than talk, but let me just ask. It's been said earlier today that given the structure, on many services at least, the feds say, we want you to do X, here's some money. We say, okay, we'll effectuate that goal. As long as that dynamic, that piece of the equation remains in place, how do you then, if your theory is right, how you do devolve it then?
To the extent you talk about county programs where the county's not really functioning as a local government, it's an agency of the state, there's nothing you can do to change that environment. Those
and in that case, an outcomes-based approach is okay for us to do, right?
I agree with that. But that's not really I think of the county's function, their municipal functions in unincorporated areas as truly local government. And the cities is truly local government. Special districts is truly local government. The functions that the counties undertake as an extension of the state is really a function as an agency of the state. And so I think you do have to bifurcate those.
Okay, so I'm trying to really understand what Steve said and also respond. One of the first things I think I should have said, even in response to Mark's question, is I'm really sympathetic to the position of the redevelopment agencies and Jim Kennedy sitting here. That is a lot of jobs. And one of the things I would say back is in terms of having a changed relationship to focus on outcomes is that you use the money, any money that you put on the table for whatever purpose, to have a new conversation, to have a new relationship. And the redevelopment agencies are in the generally they're urban in the urban areas. There are some rural, but these are the places where we want them to be as smart as possible. We want them to be all wired up. We want them to be as green as possible. And I guess I would first start asking back to Mr. Kennedy and to John Sherry and the entire RD Association. Tell us if we don't take this money, if we really get the economic stimulus, what else can you help us do? I would have that conversation, because these are the smart people. They know what they can do in terms of job generation. How much more can you leverage? Let me give that as an example. I'm very concerned about low-performing schools in California. That is sort of the policy. Let me take K-12 education. we know those low-performing schools, by and large, sit in very poor neighborhoods, and those poor neighborhoods are where the counties deliver services. But here's how services are delivered. Accepting what Steve had to say about this big bucket of health and welfare in the state budget and the big responsibilities that we have at the county level, as you know, Mark, we've got a public health worker and a social worker and a drug, alcohol, mental health worker and a probation worker, and they all carry caseloads of 500, and guess what? They're all the same 100 families. It's just that those workers aren't put in a team responsible for the same 500 families, where they're working in a neighborhood with all the resources, with the assets in that neighborhood, with the private sector. If you did that, then you sort of have cut for each of them the caseload to 100, so they actually follow 100 families, and then you have to have the element of accountability. Now, how could the state start that conversation with President Oliveira? So you've got, my God, he is the economist. Get Tony Oliveira, Supervisor Oliveira from Kings, who's president of CSAC. Is Paul still sitting there? He's probably just yelling now. Is he making faces at me? I got to know that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But so you ask the 58 counties who wants to step up and be on the lead of transforming the way in which services are delivered. Now, how do you incent that?
Right.
One way you incent that is you literally have the administration task all of these people in the agencies at the state level to be their partners locally. That's how I drove the change at BT&H, and we did the partnership in the San Joaquin Valley. No new money, no new people, just new behavior. The fact in the San Joaquin Valley, the partnership with the San Joaquin Valley, what kept the 8 counties and 62 cities actually working with us is there was 8 secretaries who were tasked to sit there with them. Now, we're not really bright, but it was perceived to be enough of an incentive for the local governments to respond. So the resources that you have of the people in a different relationship begin to make a huge amount of difference. I did a budget solution a year ago. I called it what did I call it? Reform and relief, I guess, a relief and reform. Get off the roller coaster, an R&R budget, but it was trying to share with California Forward how you take a little bit of the money that you did have and put it back on the table to provide incentives for reform. So you're not mandating a thing.
Right.
Don't want to mandate anything. It's all voluntary. And I might add that every time, and I don't go to Washington, D.C. if I don't have to. I really don't understand what happens nationally. I can imagine why you wanted to do it. And but every conversation I listen to with the new administration, they're trying to connect dots and they don't know how to. And while the ABC rule is in place, midterm elections are coming up. There's going to be a real interest in D.C. to have California be an opportunity for reform and connecting some dots. So you could put a little bit of money on the table for counties to be incented. On the school district side, let me go to schools, because I'm spending now a whole lot of time from not California Forward, but the job I actually am paid to do for the California Emerging Technology Fund on something called School to Home that Governor Schwarzenegger and Superintendent O'Connell have both endorsed. It is to get computing devices and broadband high-speed internet connections into the classrooms and the homes of all middle school students in every low-performing middle school in California. 539 low-performing schools, 180,000 students in each of those grades, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And why would we do that? It's to back into, through technology, the way to support transformation at the school site. Every school that turns around their performance does so because there's a principal who's a real leader. It starts with school leadership, a principal who values the teachers are involved, the parents are involved. And then technology gets integrated into the curriculum. You've got a bucket of money. Superintendent O'Connell has buckets of money for technology. They're not now being used to actually drive that kind of a statewide opportunity. We have the benefit of our congressional delegation directly talking to the U.S. Department of Education to perhaps do a major investment in California to start this school-to-home program. I would look at your budget being able to say, so how could I find things with technology in the K-12, maybe a little bit of extra money. I wanted to take a little bit of Prop 63 because I think we're all crazy, and we could probably justify all this reform in terms of mental health money. But to incent schools to be able to step up and start those low-performing schools to start these kinds of reforms, backed up by county. I point to Jerry because he's he's my, I guess, the last person to leave county government, right? Before Mark, I mean, there were county supervisors, and Mike. And, you're right.
Also both former Republicans.
Right. Okay. And then counties to do the reorganization of human services around that. So, I hope that made a little bit of sense to you about how to start the reform in this next budget that incents and also supports with the administrative folks we have at the state level to work with the local officials, schools and counties, and the cities are very important in all this too, to be partners, so that you start with outcomes. Focus on those outcomes.
If you like the idea of consolidated delivery of social services connected to the school-based thing, which I think makes all kinds of sense, the quickest way to get there is to consolidate the state's social service departments. It's not just the fact that you have separate departments and they all obviously fight for each other in terms of resources. It's all because they each have their own lobbying constituents. And so what happens is the community itself lobbies against this kind of consolidation. So the quickest way to get, you don't have to consolidate everything on the local level. If you get a single message coming from the state and you line the money up in a way. And I think that you're right in terms of you got to disconnect your reform stuff in terms of the initial budget thing. But I will tell you this: one value of the situation that you're leaning into is that you've gone through a couple of budget cycles where you've basically done a lot of across-the-board cutting. I hope you don't do that anymore. You need to now start to deal with, well, what is it we're going to continue to do and what is it we're going to stop doing? Because we're in the danger of just doing nothing but paying bureaucrats with no recipients on the end of the pipeline.
No, just speaking for myself, I think that this year is the opportunity to sort of pilot the direction in which the state budgeting process should go, because because of the problems we face, we're going to have to drill down with vigorous oversight on what we got, because we can't keep it all. And it's going to create a different culture than we've had here, which has formerly been things are sort of cut a little bit or increased a little bit in more or less equal amounts.
Yep.
Different year.
You're absolutely right.
Senator Wolk.
Well, part of the reason that I think performance-based budgeting is so important and is the place to start is that the way you do it is you have to involve the stakeholders. And that doesn't mean just the folks up here. It means the counties, cities. It's whoever actually has some relationship to the services that you're trying to develop results for. So I think it's just really the way to start, and we ought to be about it.
Can I just say one thing? And that is I neglected to say when I was referring to the outcomes-based approach that the one member of our panel here today who's actually got legislation on this point is Senator Wolk.
I do. Okay. Anyone else? Senator Weiland.
Sorry for. Actually had somewhat less defined, but similar legislation. It is very, very important. One thing with California Forward and all these things we're talking about, today, we need time. We're going to descend into budget hell in a month. And here's the reality. We can talk about these things. Unless someone's on a budget subcommittee, maybe you'll hear a little bit. Most of us members will know nothing about this. I mean, to be really blunt. And so I think some of the proposals and talk about, and there's many ways you can do it, about having time where we aren't in the bill factory, where we can do many more of these. We've held these hearings, learned a lot. We need to do more of them because these are just ideas. So I throw that out, and that's a proposal that I've had and I think others understand. We just need time.
Okay. Anyone else? I had a question maybe for the Marianne when you come back. We had a comment early, I think, from Senator Wolk about things that were done for AB 8. Could you do some research for us and come back when you come back with all the other things we've asked you to do today? And if you have, just from memory, I mean, I assume the LAO's done work on the, you mentioned the allocation stuff before. Do you want to respond to that? Or you can do it when you come back with us to the fuller report on January 14th.
Perhaps I could follow up with your staff, but I'm not certain as to what you're looking for. Looking for options for reforming?
No, just work that you have done. More of a historical perspective.
Issue, sure.
Right. Because I believe that was your question or comment earlier.
Yes, I focused on AB 8, but I think with respect to the realignment issue or the devolution issue, the LAO has done some analyses. Probation was one of them that was the most recent. I mean, there may be others, but I think it would be helpful to see those again.
Okay. Just thank all three of you. There is, I will say, and I've said this at all the hearings, there's certainly a sense of urgency in terms of what we've been asked to do by our leadership and the conversations we've had with our colleagues in the Republican Party, is to come back with specific recommendations that we've talked about. We've had a lot of discussion. Actually, the consistency from the testimony in our discussions have been around taking more time for oversight, so whether that's a 2-year budget cycle or skipping next year for policy or limiting the number of bills next year for policy, or the idea of maybe doing it the next 2-year cycle, something like that. And outcomes have been consistent. We heard that from mental health today. We heard it from Frank Mecca. So it strikes me, and California Forward, you've brought it up over and over again, Sonny. Those are things I've heard generally that we are on the same page or would like to continue. But clearly there are things that are going to take a lot of time and effort. And I would say the relationship between state and local government's one of them. I mean, the fact that we've been doing this for 100 years doesn't suggest to me that we're going to be able to change this in the next 4 weeks, particularly in the current circumstance. It is interesting, Sonny, as you spoke about one thing. I thought you were going to bring up service integration teams that I've brought up to this committee before. There are eight counties, I think, that did that during the Wilson administration. It was really simple. The legislature and the governor gave the parameters for these grants. I don't know if San Mateo had one. I think they did. But the idea was just to convene all those service providers literally in the communities where I mean, it's a retail concept. Put the services in the community where they're needed. Now, in our county, we've measured those for 15, I mean, you started them, Sonny, so I don't want to date you. But as it's measured against the general population, that group has outperformed the general population. Yes. I was accused by my friends at SEIU at one point, is because I was an advocate for the program, that they were going to make me the head of the Department of SIT, Service Integration Team. So there are, and there's another example in Kansas City and St. Louis that's led to their success around juvenile justice called LINK, which is the same sort of model. I mean, this is not recreating. So there are things I think we can look at where I refer to as sort of the gestalt of, and then you add local government and school districts, and it's really just going back to the future. You're providing the services where they're needed, as opposed to these large bureaucracies. So I would think there's some commonality from all of us that we would want to evaluate that, which gets me to the last point. So far, most of the conversations, with some differences, have been less at this committee around ideological differences, although there legitimately are some, expressed as more about how do we, especially in a term-limited world, have more analytical tools given to us so that we can oversee and make the right investment, as opposed to spending a lot of time on ideological pronunciation. So I get, and Mike, if you were trying to bring this back, is that if we have one more hearing as charged by the leadership, and that's January 14th in this building, sort of come back and discuss. So what I'd like to ask is that all of you, and we'll try to do this individually, and well, ask for the Republican leadership, if we can convene in this discussion informally, so that we can basically have a work product that's as specific as possible in the short term, but then all of us in the same time, maybe midterm, longer term. So unless, Mike, you want to chime in here?
No, I only for half a second. I just wanted to underscore again, we'll continue to circulate the attempt at, here are some ideas around potential consensus, need to get reaction from people on what that looks like. on or about the middle of next month, the goal is for us to be able to find what are common ground ideas, and also propose some things that may not be common ground ideas, but to find as much consensus and truly do it jointly as we can.
And I make those comments with the three wise people in the spirit of the season, three wise men, I would say, Sonny. Three wise people here, because if you have pearls of wisdom, and Mike, seriously, thank you for all your years of service. And I know I don't want to drag you back into this, but if there are things you feel like you could help us with and share with us informally, please call us or send us an email. And same for local government. So thank you all very much for your time. Thanks for attending.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Public comment. Anyone who would like to speak to the committee on this particular agenda item? Consistent with the previous group of public comment, they want to be left alone. So also to our partners who are on the second panel, if you could engage us in, understand everybody's got to protect their turf, but if you can offer more specific suggestions, we're all ears. So with that, I want to thank the sergeants and all of my colleagues, and we're adjourned.